The chains snapped before anyone could scream a warning. Elira felt the floor shake beneath her feet as she ran down the last stone steps into the dungeon, her lantern swinging wildly, throwing crooked shadows across the walls. Smoke curled from the far corner, where the great creature strained against its bindings, its golden eyes blazing in the dark, its wings scraping sparks from the stone ceiling. Guards lay scattered near the entrance, thrown aside like broken toys, groaning but alive. No one had made it past the beast in over a year. No one had even tried. She should have turned around. She should have run back up the stairs and let the king's soldiers handle what they always handled, with spears and fire. But her feet kept moving forward, drawn by something she could not name, something that made her chest ache with a strange, unshakable certainty that the creature before her was not simply a monster. "Stop," she whispered, though the word barely left her lips. To her shock, the dragon's head turned toward her. Its enormous body, easily 3 times the size of the largest warhorse in the kingdom, went still. The chains, half torn from the wall, hung slack from its front legs. Steam rose from its nostrils, but its golden eyes, sharp and impossibly intelligent, studied her with something that looked almost like recognition. Behind her, boots thundered down the stairs. Torchlight flooded the chamber, and with it came the voice that made every servant in Draveth Castle go quiet with fear. "Get back." King Cale Ashgrave stepped past his soldiers, his black cloak snapping behind him, his hand resting on the hilt of a blade that had ended more lives than anyone in the kingdom cared to count. He was young for a king, only a few years past 30, but the weight of command sat on him like armor forged into his skin. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, moved from the dragon to the girl standing calmly in its path, and something in his expression shifted from fury to disbelief. "I said get back," he repeated, quieter this time, though the danger in his voice had not faded. Elira did not move. She could not explain why, only that running now felt more dangerous than staying. The dragon's breathing had slowed. Its wings, which moments ago had been beating against the chamber walls hard enough to crack stone, folded gently against its scaled sides. It lowered its massive head until its eyes were level with hers. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, not taking her gaze off the creature, "please don't attack. I don't think it wants to hurt anyone." A low murmur ran through the soldiers gathered at the entrance. Attacking a dragon that had just broken free of its chains, in front of the servant girl standing in its shadow, was not a decision anyone wanted to make. Cale raised a hand, signaling his men to hold their spears. "You have no idea what that thing has done," he said. His voice was low, tight with something that sounded almost like old grief. "It killed 3 men before it was ever chained. It is not a pet, Elira." He knew her name. That surprised her more than anything else happening in that moment. More than the dragon's stillness, more than the smoke and the broken chains and the frightened soldiers pressed against the far wall. She was a servant, one of dozens who worked in the lower halls of the castle, sweeping floors and carrying water. Kings did not learn the names of servants. "I've been bringing it food," she admitted, because there seemed little point in hiding it now. "For the past few weeks, in secret." Cale's jaw tightened. "You've been coming down here alone." "Yes." "Into a chamber that has claimed the lives of every handler assigned to it." "Yes, Your Majesty." He looked at her the way a man looks at something he cannot make sense of, something that defies every rule he has built his life around. Then he looked back at the dragon, which had settled onto its haunches, its golden eyes half closed, its enormous chest rising and falling in slow, calm breaths, as though the chaos of moments ago had never happened. "Everyone out," Cale said finally, without looking away from the dragon. "Leave us." The soldiers hesitated. One of them, an older man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, it isn't safe." "I gave an order." The soldiers filed out, casting uneasy glances at Elira as they passed, some with pity, some with something closer to suspicion. When the last set of footsteps faded up the stone stairwell, the chamber fell silent except for the soft crackle of torches and the low, steady breathing of the great beast in the corner. Cale turned to her fully now, his cloak settling around him, the torchlight carving hard lines across his face. "Explain." Elira swallowed. There was no easy way to explain something she did not fully understand herself. "A few weeks ago, I was sent down here to clean the old storage room. I heard something crying, not roaring, crying, like something in pain, not something angry. I know it sounds foolish. Go on. I came closer. It didn't attack me. It just watched me, the way it's watching me now. So I started leaving food. Bread, mostly. Whatever I could take from the kitchens without anyone noticing. I never told anyone. I was afraid you would forbid it, or worse, that the guards would think I'd lost my mind. You very well might have, Kale said, though there was no real bite in the words anymore. He studied the dragon for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention back to her. Do you understand what could have happened to you? If it had turned on you even once, there would have been nothing left to bury. I understand the risk, she said quietly. I chose it anyway. Something flickered behind his stormy eyes, something that looked almost like respect, though it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the guarded distance that seemed to live permanently on his face. He was not a man who let his thoughts show easily, and Alira had the distinct sense that whatever was happening behind those eyes now was something he did not fully understand either. The dragon shifted, drawing both their attention. It lowered its head toward Alira again, this time closing the distance, until its enormous snout hovered only a few feet from her outstretched hand. She did not flinch. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and laid her palm against the warm, rough scales along its jaw. The creature made a low sound, something between a growl and a sigh, and pressed gently into her touch. Kale watched the exchange with an expression she could not read. In 3 years, he said quietly, it has not let a single soul near it. Not the healers I sent to check its wounds. Not the handlers who tried to feed it through iron bars. Not even me. Alira turned to look at him, surprised. You've tried. More times than I care to admit. He said it simply, without elaboration, though something in his tone told her there was a story buried beneath those words, one he had no intention of sharing tonight. And yet here you stand, touching it as though it were no more dangerous than a hound by the hearth. Maybe it only needed someone who wasn't afraid of it. Everyone is afraid of it, he said. That is rather the point of keeping it chained beneath my castle, instead of walking free in my kingdom. Then maybe, Alira said carefully, aware she was pushing further than a servant should ever push with a king. It needed someone who wasn't afraid of it, and who also didn't think of it only as something to be kept. Kale's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with the sharp focus of a man reconsidering everything he thought he understood about the situation in front of him. He said nothing for a long moment, simply watching the way the dragon leaned into her hand, the way its enormous body, capable of tearing the chamber apart, had gone utterly still and calm in her presence. The chains will need to be repaired, he said finally, his voice returning to its usual commanding tone, though something beneath it had softened. Tonight, before the household wakes and word spreads that the beast broke free. Of course, Your Majesty. And you. He fixed his gaze on her again, and this time there was no anger in it, only a strange, careful curiosity. You will report to me directly. Not to the head of the household, not to the guard captain, to me. I want to understand what it is about you that this creature responds to. Alira felt her pulse quicken, though whether from fear or something else entirely, she could not say. Yes, Your Majesty. He turned to leave, his cloak sweeping behind him, but paused at the base of the stairs and looked back at her one final time. His expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something gentler, something almost hopeful, though he seemed to catch himself before it could fully show. Alira, he said, testing the name aloud, as though he had never quite used it before. That is a servant's name I will not be forgetting again. Then he was gone, his footsteps fading up the stone stairwell, leaving her alone in the torchlit chamber with the great dragon, whose golden eyes had never once left her face. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and turned back to the creature, running her hand once more along its scaled jaw. You gave us both quite a fright tonight, she murmured. Breaking those chains. What was it? Did something frighten you? The dragon made no answer, of course, only a low rumble deep in its chest that might have been agreement, or might have been nothing more than the sound of a great beast settling for rest. But as she looked into its golden eyes, Alira had the strangest feeling that it understood every word she said, that somewhere behind that ancient, unblinking gaze, There was a mind far more complex than anyone in the castle suspected. She thought of the whispers she had heard among the older servants, hushed conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room. Whispers about the dragon's arrival 3 years ago, about the war with the kingdom beyond the eastern mountains, about a young prince who had vanished the very same season the creature first appeared in chains beneath Draveth Castle. She had always assumed they were simply old stories. The kind servants told each other to pass long, tedious nights. But standing here now, with the dragon's warm breath against her palm, and the memory of the king's unreadable expression fresh in her mind, she was no longer certain. There was more to this creature than anyone had told her. She could feel it, the same way she had felt, from the very first night she crept down these stairs with a loaf of stolen bread, that this was no ordinary beast waiting quietly in the dark. Above her, the castle was waking. She could hear the distant sound of servants beginning their morning duties, the creak of doors, the clatter of pails being filled at the well. Soon someone would come looking for her, and she would need an explanation for why she had spent half the night in the dungeon instead of asleep in the servants' quarters. But for now, in the flickering torchlight, with the enormous creature resting its head near her feet, like something far gentler than the monster the entire kingdom feared, Allura allowed herself a small, private smile. Whatever this was, whatever strange thread had pulled her into this chamber and bound her to a creature no one else could approach, she had the feeling her life had just changed in ways she could not yet begin to understand. She gathered her lantern, gave the dragon one last gentle touch along its jaw, and made her way back up the stairs, unaware that far above her, in his private chambers, King Chaol Ashgrave stood at his window, staring out over the dark kingdom, turning over in his mind a truth he had guarded for 3 long years, wondering, for the first time since the war ended, whether the secret he carried might finally have found its way toward being undone. The morning brought its usual noise and business to Draveth Castle. Servants scrubbed floors, kitchen fires roared to life, and the great hall filled with the low murmur of nobles beginning their day. No one who passed Allura in the corridors that morning would have guessed that only hours before she had stood inches from a creature capable of leveling half the castle, her palm pressed calmly against its scales, while the King of Draveth watched in stunned silence. She moved through her morning duties in a daze, her thoughts circling back again and again to the strange warmth in the dragon's eyes, to the king's unreadable expression, to the promise she had made to report to him directly. Word had not yet spread about the incident in the dungeon, which surprised her, until she realized the guards who had witnessed it were likely too unsettled, or too loyal, to speak of what they had seen. By midday, a young page found her scrubbing pots in the kitchen, and informed her, with wide, nervous eyes, that the king requested her presence in his study before the evening meal. The head cook, a stout woman named Bridget who had worked in the castle for 30 years, nearly dropped a ladle in shock. "The king's study," Bridget repeated, staring at Allura as though she had grown a second head. "In all my years, I've never once heard of a serving girl being summoned there. What in the world have you done, child?"
"I don't know,"
Allura lied, because the truth was too strange, too dangerous to speak aloud in a kitchen full of listening ears. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of nervous anticipation, her hands moving through familiar tasks, while her mind wandered back to the dungeon, to the dragon's golden eyes, to the king's low voice asking her to explain herself. When the appointed hour finally arrived, she smoothed her plain dress as best she could, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and made her way through the castle's winding halls toward the king's private study, her heart hammering with every step. The guards outside the heavy oak doors regarded her with open curiosity as she approached, but said nothing, simply pushing the doors open to admit her. Inside, the study was warm and dimly lit, lined with tall shelves of old books and maps, a fire crackling in the hearth. King Chaol stood near the window, his back to her, his hands clasped behind him, still dressed in the dark, practical clothing of a man more comfortable on a battlefield than in a throne room. "Close the door," he said without turning. She did, her pulse quickening at the quiet authority in his voice. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Allura stood near the entrance, unsure whether to wait or approach, while Chaol remained at the window, staring out at the darkening sky, as though gathering his thoughts before he trusted himself to speak them aloud. "3 years ago," he said finally, still not turning to face her, "a war ended between Draveth and the kingdom, beyond the eastern mountains. A war my father began, and one I was forced to finish in his place after his death. It cost more lives than I care to count, on both sides." He paused, his shoulders tightening almost imperceptibly. "And it did not end the way the histories claim." Alira said nothing, sensing that whatever he was about to tell her was something he had carried alone for a very long time. "The creature beneath this castle," he continued, finally turning to face her, his gray eyes heavy with something that looked like old sorrow, "did not arrive as a beast to be conquered. It arrived because of something I have never spoken of to another living soul outside this room, and I find myself, against every instinct I possess, about to speak of it now, to a serving girl, who somehow managed to calm in one evening what my finest healers could not calm in 3 years." "Your Majesty," Alira said softly, "you don't have to tell me anything." "I know," he said, "and yet I find that I want to." He crossed the room slowly, stopping a respectful distance away, studying her face, as though searching for something he could not quite name. "What I am about to tell you does not leave this room. Do you understand me? Not to the kitchens, not to the other servants, not to anyone within these walls." "I understand." He took a breath, and for the first time since she had known him, even briefly, even from a distance, King Cale Ashgrave looked less like the feared alpha ruler of Draveth, and more like a man burdened by a secret too heavy to carry alone any longer. "The dragon," he said quietly, "was not always a dragon." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than anything Alira had expected. She had suspected, from the whispers she'd heard among the older servants, that there was more to the creature than its scales and fire, but hearing it confirmed by the king himself sent a shiver down her spine. "A person," she said slowly, testing the idea aloud. "The dragon was once a person." Cale's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might retreat back into silence, back into the guarded distance that seemed to be his natural state. Instead, he walked to the hearth and stared into the flames, his hands braced against the mantel. "His name was Edmund," he said, "Prince Edmund of Calderwyn, second son of the king who ruled beyond the eastern mountains. We were not enemies once. We were boys together, sent to the same border academy to learn swordsmanship and diplomacy in equal measure, back when our fathers still believed peace between our kingdoms was possible." A faint, bitter smile crossed his face. "We were closer than brothers, once." "What happened?" "My father happened." Cale's voice hardened. He believed Calderwyn's mines held wealth that belonged, by some ancient claim, to Draveth. He built an army on that belief, and marched east, before I was old enough to stop him, or wise enough to understand that I should have tried harder than I did. He turned from the fire, his gray eyes distant, lost somewhere in memory. "Edmund's people fought back, of course. Wars are rarely as simple as one side wanting, and the other side losing. It dragged on for years. Villages burned. Soldiers who had once trained together as boys found themselves facing one another across battlefields." Alira listened in silence, sensing that interrupting him now would close a door that might never open again. "My father died in the 4th year of the war," Cale continued. "Command fell to me. I was younger than you are now, thrust into a war I never wanted, expected to finish what he started, because an alpha does not simply walk away from his father's ambitions, even the foolish ones." His hands curled into fists at his sides. "I tried to end it. I sent word to Calderwyn, offering terms, offering peace, hoping that whatever remained of my friendship with Edmund might carry more weight than the crown on my head. Did it work?" For a time, something flickered across his face, an old grief he had clearly never allowed himself to fully feel. "Edmund and I met in secret, away from both our courts, to negotiate an end to the fighting our fathers had begun. We nearly succeeded, and then Calderwyn's court sorcerer, a man who had convinced Edmund's father that the war could still be won through darker means than steel and soldiers, discovered our meetings. He saw them as treason. He saw Edmund's willingness to make peace with me as weakness, as betrayal of his own kingdom." Alira's stomach tightened, sensing where the story was leading before Cale spoke the words aloud. "He cursed him," Cale said quietly. "In the middle of our final meeting, before either of us understood what was happening, the sorcerer appeared, and struck Edmund down, with magic older and darker than anything either of our kingdoms had faced in generations. I watched my closest friend transform in front of me, his body twisting into something monstrous, something neither human nor entirely beast, while I stood helpless, unable to stop it. "That's horrible," Alira whispered. It was worse than horrible. Cale's voice had grown rough, stripped of its usual royal composure. The sorcerer fled before I could reach him. Edmund, in his new form, was in agony, confused, dangerous, in ways he had never been as a man. My soldiers, who had followed me to the meeting expecting a diplomatic exchange, saw only a monster attacking their king, and reacted the only way soldiers know how to react. It took everything I had to stop them from killing him where he stood. "So you brought him here instead?" "I brought him here," Cale confirmed, "because it was the only way I could think to protect what remained of my friend, and because some small, desperate part of me believed that if I kept him close, I might eventually find a way to break whatever curse had been placed on him." The war ended not long after, both kingdoms too exhausted and too shaken by what had happened to continue fighting. But Edmund never returned to human form. Not once, in 3 long years, despite every healer, every scholar, every scrap of ancient text I have had brought before me. He finally looked at her again, and the weight in his eyes was unmistakable now, the loneliness of a man who had carried this secret in silence for far too long. I chained him, not because I feared him, though in his early days, the pain of the curse made him dangerous in ways none of us could predict, but because I did not know what else to do. I have watched my closest friend suffer beneath this castle for 3 years, and nothing I have tried has ever brought him even a moment of peace. "Until last night," Alira said softly. "Until last night," he agreed, his gaze steady on hers now, searching, careful, as though he were trying to read some answer, written into her features, that even she did not know was there. "In 3 years, Alira, I have never seen him calm the way he was calm with you. Not once." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and Alira felt the full weight of what she had stumbled into settle over her, heavier than anything she had ever carried in her life. She was no longer simply a servant girl who had taken pity on a chained beast. She was standing at the center of a secret that could unravel the fragile peace between 2 kingdoms, holding, without fully understanding how, a thread that might be the only hope of undoing a curse that had haunted a king for 3 long years. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. Cale studied her for a long moment before answering, his expression unreadable once more, though something in the set of his shoulders had softened since he'd first begun speaking. "I don't yet know," he admitted, "but I intend to find out." 3 days passed before Alira was summoned to the king's study again, though in that time she found herself unable to think of anything else. She moved through her usual duties with her mind circling endlessly around the story Cale had told her, around the image of a young prince transformed into a monster in front of his closest friend, around the strange golden eyes that had watched her so calmly in the dark. She had returned to the dungeon twice since that night, always with the king's quiet permission, always accompanied by 2 guards who waited at the top of the stairs rather than descending with her. Edmund, as she now thought of the dragon, greeted her each time with the same gentle stillness, lowering his massive head so she could rest her palm against his scales, making that same low sound in his chest that she had come to think of as something close to contentment. "You know who you are," she told him during her second visit, her voice barely above a whisper in the quiet chamber. "Somewhere in there, you remember, don't you?" The dragon's golden eyes had studied her for a long moment, unblinking, before he lowered his head further, resting it gently against the stone floor near her feet, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his scales. It was not an answer, not in any way she could prove to another living soul, but she felt certain, in the quiet space between them, that somewhere beneath the enormous scaled body, Edmund understood every word. On the morning of the 3rd day, a page found her in the castle gardens, where she had been sent to help gather herbs for the kitchen, and informed her that the king requested her presence immediately. She followed the boy through the winding halls, her heart picking up its familiar nervous rhythm, until she reached the study and found Cale standing over a table covered in old maps and yellowed scrolls, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You wanted to see me, Your Majesty?" He looked up, and something in his expression eased slightly at the sight of her, though he quickly masked it beneath his usual composed authority. "I've spent the last 3 days searching through every text in this castle's library for any mention of the curse that was placed on Edmund. Most of it is useless. Old wives' tales, half-remembered legends, nothing of any real substance. He gestured to the scroll spread across the table. But I found something in an older text, brought back from Calderwin by one of my father's scholars, that I think you should see. Elira crossed to the table and looked down at the ancient, brittle parchment he indicated. The writing was faded, some of it in a language she did not recognize, but Cale had marked a passage in the margin with fresh ink, a rough translation scrawled beside the original text. It speaks of curses tied to selfless devotion, he explained, watching her read. Curses that cannot be broken through force, or wealth, or even the caster's own hand, but only through an act of genuine, selfless care, from someone with no stake in the outcome, someone who wants nothing from the person they are trying to save. Elira looked up at him, understanding beginning to dawn. You think that's why he responds to me? I think, Cale said carefully, that everyone who has approached Edmund in the past 3 years has done so out of duty, or fear, or obligation. Healers sent by royal order. Handlers assigned as punishment. Soldiers ordered to guard him. Even I have visited him with the weight of guilt and responsibility hanging over every conversation, because some part of me will always believe his suffering is my fault, for failing to protect him during our meeting, all those years ago. He paused, his gray eyes steady on hers. You are the only person who has ever gone to him simply because you wanted to help, because you heard something crying in the dark and could not walk away. The weight of what he was suggesting settled over her slowly, heavier with each passing second. You think I might be able to break the curse? I think it's possible, he said. I don't know how, or what it would require, or whether the old texts are even reliable, but I have exhausted every other path in 3 years of searching, and you are the first genuine possibility I have found. Elira sat down slowly in the chair across from him, her mind spinning with the implications. What would you need me to do? Spend time with him, Cale said. More time than you already have. Learn him, if such a thing is possible with a creature trapped in that form. I will arrange for you to be reassigned from your kitchen duties so that you can visit him freely, without needing to sneak away or explain your absence to anyone. And if it doesn't work? If I spend months with him and nothing changes? Then at the very least, Cale said quietly, he will have known kindness during his suffering, which is more than I have managed to give him in 3 years of guilt and helplessness. He held her gaze for a long moment. But I do not believe it will fail, Elira. I have watched too many things fail these past 3 years to recognize easily when something, finally, might succeed. She thought of the dragon's golden eyes, of the way his enormous body had gone still and calm the moment she touched him, of the low, contented sound he made when she spoke softly to him in the dark. She thought, too, of the king standing before her now, a man who carried the guilt of his friend's suffering like a stone lodged permanently in his chest, offering her, a servant girl with no name worth remembering a week ago, the chance to undo 3 years of pain. I'll do it, she said. I'll spend as much time with him as it takes. Something shifted in Cale's expression, relief mixed with something warmer, something he seemed to catch and suppress before it could fully surface. Thank you, he said simply, though the words carried more weight than their brevity suggested. I know I am asking a great deal of you, for no reward beyond my gratitude. He's suffering, Elira said simply. That's reward enough, knowing I might be able to help him. Cale studied her for a long moment, and Elira had the distinct sense that he was seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a curious anomaly who had somehow calmed his dangerous secret, but as a person whose kindness ran deeper than he had expected to find in anyone within his court. It unsettled him, she could tell, in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Starting tomorrow, he said, clearing his throat and returning to the more familiar authority of a king issuing instructions. You will report to the dungeon each morning. I will inform the guards to grant you full access, and you will report back to me each evening on anything you observe, anything that changes, no matter how small it might seem. Yes, Your Majesty. And Elira. He paused as she turned to leave, and when she looked back, his expression had softened into something almost gentle. Thank you, truly. You have given me hope I did not expect to feel again. She left the study with her heart pounding, though not entirely from nerves this time. Something had shifted in that room, something beyond the practical arrangement of her new duties, something in the way the king had looked at her, as though she were no longer simply a servant, but someone whose presence mattered to him, in ways neither of them fully understood yet. That night, she lay awake in the narrow servants' quarters long after the other girls had fallen asleep, staring up at the shadowed ceiling, turning over everything she had learned in the past 3 days. A cursed prince, a grieving king, an ancient curse that could only be broken by someone who wanted nothing in return, and somehow, impossibly, she found herself standing at the very center of it all, holding a thread of hope that an entire kingdom did not yet know existed. She thought of Edmund's golden eyes, patient and searching in the dark, and wondered what kind of man he had been before the curse took his form, before 3 years of chains and isolation had worn him down to something the world called a monster. She wondered, too, about the boy Cale must have been, before the crown and the war and the guilt had carved him into the guarded, formidable alpha king the kingdom feared, back when he and Edmund had trained together as friends, believing peace between their kingdoms was possible. So much had been lost to that war. So much pain had settled into the stones of this castle, into the chained creature beneath it, into the king who carried the weight of failing to protect his closest friend. And yet, lying there in the dark, Elira felt something stir inside her that she had not expected. A quiet, stubborn hope that perhaps, against every terrible thing that had happened, something good might still be salvaged from the wreckage. Tomorrow, she would begin in earnest. Tomorrow, she would return to the dungeon not as a curious servant sneaking scraps of bread to a chained beast, but as the one person in the entire kingdom who might hold the key to setting a cursed prince free. She closed her eyes, finally letting exhaustion pull her towards sleep, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, her dreams were not filled with the endless, gray routine of servant's work, but with golden eyes watching her from the dark, patient and waiting, as though they too understood that something important was about to begin. Morning came sooner than she expected, gray light creeping through the narrow window of the servants' quarters, while the other girls still slept. Elira rose quietly, dressed in her plain work clothes, and made her way through the castle's silent corridors toward the kitchens, where Bridget was already awake, kneading dough with practiced hands. "You're up early," Bridget said without looking up. "And you've been reassigned, so the steward tells me. Something about the dungeons." She glanced up then, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You be careful down there, child. Whatever business the king has given you, it's not the sort of thing servants usually get pulled into." "I'll be careful," Elira promised, taking a small bundle of bread and dried meat that Bridget had already set aside for her, as though she had known Elira would need it before either of them had spoken a word. The walk down to the dungeon felt different that morning, no longer the nervous, secretive journey of a girl breaking rules in the dark, but something closer to purpose. The guards at the entrance, who had regarded her with suspicion only days before, now simply nodded and stepped aside, having received their instructions from the king himself. Edmund was waiting when she descended the final stairs, his golden eyes finding hers the moment her lantern light touched the chamber. He made no move to rise, simply watched her approach with the same patient stillness she had come to know, though there was something different in his posture that morning, something almost eager, as though he too understood that this visit marked the beginning of something new. "Good morning," she said softly, setting down her bundle and settling onto the low stone bench that had been placed near his corner of the chamber, presumably at the king's instruction. "I hope you slept well, though I suppose that's a strange thing to ask a dragon." He made a low sound in his chest, something between a rumble and a sigh, and lowered his head until it rested near her feet, exactly as it had before. She reached out and pressed her palm against the warm scales along his jaw, feeling the same strange calm settle over both of them that she had felt every time before. "The king told me about you," she said quietly, "about Edmund, about everything that happened." She watched his golden eyes for any flicker of reaction, any sign that the name meant something to him still, buried somewhere beneath the curse. "I don't know if you can understand me. I don't know if there's still a person in there who remembers who he was. But I want you to know that I'm going to keep coming back, every day, for as long as it takes." The dragon's eyes seemed to soften, though she could not have said how a creature with no eyebrows, no truly expressive features beyond those ancient golden eyes, managed to convey something so close to emotion. He shifted closer, his massive body curling slightly around where she sat, not in a threatening way, but in a manner that felt almost protective, almost like the careful, deliberate closeness of someone who had been alone for far too long and had finally found something worth holding on to. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while, the torchlight flickering against the stone walls, the only sounds the soft crackle of flame and the slow, steady breathing of the enormous creature beside her. Elira found herself talking, eventually, filling the quiet with stories from her own life, small and unremarkable as they seemed, compared to the weight of curses and wars. But she spoke them anyway, sensing that Edmund, whatever remained of him beneath the scales, was listening. She told him about growing up in a small village on the edge of the kingdom, about losing her parents to a fever when she was still young, about the years she had spent moving between distant relatives who could barely afford to feed her, until she had finally found her way to Draveth Castle and a position in the kitchens that, however humble, had at least given her a steady roof and a purpose. She told him about the small kindnesses that had carried her through difficult years, about Bridget's gruff affection, about the quiet satisfaction of good, honest work. "I know what it's like to feel forgotten," she said softly, near the end of her visit, as the hour grew late, and she knew she would need to return to report to the king. "Not the same as you, of course, nothing like what you've endured, but I know what it feels like to be overlooked, to have people decide who you are before they've ever bothered to ask. I think that's part of why I couldn't just walk away that first night. I recognized something in the way you cried, even if I couldn't understand the words." Edmund's golden eyes held hers for a long moment, and in that silence, Elira felt something pass between them that words could never quite capture. An understanding, fragile but real, forming in the space where a cursed prince and a forgotten servant girl had somehow found each other in the dark. Weeks passed, and the pattern of Elira's days settled into something she had never expected to find in her life at Draveth Castle. Each morning she descended into the dungeon before the rest of the household had fully woken, spending long hours in Edmund's company, talking, sitting quietly, watching the slow, steady changes that seemed to come over him with each visit. His eyes grew brighter, his movements, once heavy and listless, took on a new alertness, as though something long dormant inside him was beginning, slowly, to stir back to life. And each evening, without fail, she found herself summoned to the king's study to report what she had observed. At first, these meetings were brief and businesslike, Cale standing at his usual place near the window while she recounted the small details of her day, the way Edmund had responded to a particular story, the way his breathing had changed when she spoke of the war, the way he seemed calmest in the hours just after dawn. But as the days turned into weeks, the meetings began to stretch longer, the conversation drifting further from Edmund and closer to something neither of them had quite named yet. "You mentioned he grew agitated today," Cale said one evening, standing near the fire with a glass of wine he had not touched. "When you spoke of the Eastern Mountains." "He did," Elira confirmed, settling into the chair that had, without either of them commenting on it, become hers during these evening visits. His whole body tensed. "I stopped speaking of it after that, and he calmed within a few minutes." Cale nodded slowly, his gray eyes distant. "The mountains separate our kingdoms. It's possible some part of him remembers what happened there, even trapped as he is." "Do you think about it often?" Elira asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. "The war, I mean. What happened to him?" "Every day," Cale admitted, and there was a rawness in his voice that she had not heard from him before, not even when he had first told her the story of Edmund's curse. "I have spent 3 years believing his suffering is a debt I owe, one I can never fully repay, no matter how many healers I summon, or how many old texts I search through." He turned to look at her, firelight catching the sharp lines of his face. "You have done more in a few weeks than I managed in 3 years, Elira. I hope you understand what that means to me." "I'm not doing anything special," she said, though warmth crept into her cheeks at the sincerity in his voice. "I'm only spending time with him, talking, listening. That is precisely what makes it special," Cale said quietly. "Everyone else who has approached him, myself included, has done so weighed down by fear, or guilt, or duty. You approach him simply as yourself, without any of that weight. I have come to believe that is the very thing he has needed most, more than any healer's remedy or scholar's theory." Their conversations, over those weeks, began to wander beyond Edmund entirely. Cale, guarded and distant with nearly everyone else in his court, found himself speaking to Elira about things he had never shared with another living soul, The loneliness of ruling a kingdom that both feared and depended on him, the crushing weight of expectations placed on him since childhood, the quiet grief he still carried for a father whose ambitions had cost so many lives, including, in its own way, the life of his closest friend. Elira, in turn, found herself opening up in ways she had never allowed herself with anyone, not even Bridget, who had been closest thing to family she'd known since her parents' deaths. She spoke of her fears, her hopes, the quiet ache of never quite belonging anywhere, of moving through the world as someone easily overlooked. Cale listened to all of it with a focus and attentiveness that startled her, as though her words carried a weight he had not expected to find in the thoughts of a servant girl. "You see people clearly," he told her one evening, several weeks into their arrangement, as she prepared to leave his study for the night. "Most people in my court see only what they want from me, or what they fear from me. You seem to see something else entirely." "Maybe I just see you," Elira said softly, before she could stop the words from leaving her mouth. "Not the king. Just you." Something shifted in his expression, quick and unguarded, before the familiar composure settled back over his features. "That is a rare thing," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Rarer than you might realize." Their days took on a rhythm, neither of them spoke of directly, but both seemed to understand. Mornings with Edmund in the quiet dark of the dungeon, evenings with Cale in the warm light of his study, and somewhere in between, a growing awareness that the boundaries separating servant from king, and duty from something far more personal, were beginning to blur in ways neither of them had anticipated when this had all begun. One evening, nearly 2 months after that first chaotic night in the dungeon, Cale surprised her by joining her visit to Edmund, rather than waiting for her report afterward. He descended the dungeon stairs behind her, his usual guarded posture softening the moment his eyes fell on the dragon curled peacefully in the corner of the chamber. "He looks different," Cale said quietly, studying his old friend with an expression caught somewhere between wonder and old grief. "Calmer. I don't think I've seen him this settled since before the curse." "Come sit with us," Elira offered, gesturing to the space beside her on the stone bench. Cale hesitated, and for a moment she thought he might refuse, might retreat back into the careful distance he maintained with nearly everyone in his life. But then he crossed the chamber and settled onto the bench beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, close enough that Edmund's golden eyes shifted between the two of them with something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Edmund," Cale said softly, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "I am sorry, for every day you have suffered in this chamber, for every year. It has taken me to find someone who could reach you the way I never could." The dragon shifted, lifting his massive head to look at Cale directly, and for a long moment, the two of them simply stared at one another, old friend to old friend, across a distance that neither the years nor the curse had fully managed to erase. Then, slowly, Edmund lowered his head and pressed it gently against Cale's shoulder, a gesture so unexpectedly gentle that Elira felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "He remembers you," she whispered. "I hope so," Cale said, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer fully hide. "I hope some part of him has always remembered, even through everything." They sat together in the quiet chamber for a long while after that, the three of them, an unlikely gathering of a cursed prince, a grieving king, and the servant girl, who had somehow become the thread connecting them both. And when Elira finally rose to leave, gathering her things in the flickering torchlight, Cale walked beside her up the long stone stairwell, closer than protocol required, closer than either of them acknowledged aloud. "Thank you," he said quietly, as they reached the top of the stairs and the warm glow of the castle's evening torches replaced the dungeon's cooler light. "For everything you have given him, for everything you have given me, if I am honest." "You don't need to thank me," Elira said, though her heart raced at the sincerity in his voice, at the warmth in his gray eyes that seemed to have softened considerably in the weeks since they had first met in that chaotic, chain-broken chamber. "I do," he said simply, "more than you know." They stood together in the quiet corridor for a moment longer than necessary, the space between them charged with something neither had spoken aloud, something that had been growing steadily beneath the surface of their evening conversations and morning arrangements, something that felt, to Elira, both thrilling and deeply frightening in equal measure. "I should return to my quarters," she said finally, breaking the silence before it could grow into something neither of them was ready to name. "Of course," Cale said, though something in his expression suggested reluctance. "Good night, Illyra." As she walked away down the torchlit corridor, she could feel his eyes following her, and she wondered, not for the first time in recent weeks, whether the thread pulling her toward Edmund's chamber each morning had somehow become tangled with an entirely different, entirely unexpected thread pulling her toward the king himself. The following weeks brought changes that neither of them could ignore, no matter how carefully they tried to keep their growing closeness contained within the walls of the study and the dungeon. Servants began to notice the king's frequent absences from evening gatherings, his tendency to retreat to his study earlier than usual, the way his gaze softened whenever Illyra's name came up in casual conversation among the household staff. Bridget, sharp-eyed as ever despite her gruff exterior, cornered Illyra in the kitchen one afternoon, flour dusting her apron as she set down her rolling pin with a pointed look. "You've changed, child," she said, studying Illyra's face with the careful attention of a woman who had raised half the kitchen staff through their difficult years. "There's a light in you that wasn't there before. I'd wager it has less to do with that dragon, and more to do with the man who keeps summoning you to his study each evening." "It's not like that," Illyra protested, though the warmth rising in her cheeks likely told a different story. "Mind yourself," Bridget said, not unkindly, though worry creased her brow. "Kings marry for kingdoms, not kitchen girls. I'd hate to see you hurt, chasing something that was never meant to be yours." The words stayed with Illyra long after that conversation ended, settling uncomfortably in her chest as she made her way through her daily routine. She knew Bridget meant well, knew the older woman's warning came from genuine care rather than cruelty, but she could not shake the growing awareness that whatever was developing between herself and King Cale had moved far beyond the simple arrangement of caring for his cursed friend. That evening, during her usual report in his study, she found herself watching him more carefully than usual, noting the way his gray eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary, the way his usually guarded posture relaxed the instant she entered the room. He had changed too, she realized, in ways the entire castle had begun to whisper about, though few dared voice their observations openly. "You seem distracted tonight," Cale observed, setting aside the scroll he had been reading when she arrived. "Is something troubling you?" Illyra hesitated, unsure whether to voice the concern that had been building in her chest since Bridget's warning. "The household has begun to talk," she said finally, "about your absences, about these evening meetings." Something flickered across Cale's face, quickly suppressed. "Let them talk," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "I answer to no one for how I spend my evenings." "You answer to your court," Illyra reminded him gently. "To the nobles who expect you to marry within your own rank, to secure alliances rather than spend your evenings with a servant girl discussing a chained dragon." Cale's jaw tightened, and he rose from his desk, crossing to the window with the restless energy of a man wrestling with thoughts he had not yet fully allowed himself to examine. "I am aware of what my court expects," he said quietly. "I have been aware of it since the day I inherited this crown. Marriage as strategy, alliance as affection. It is the way of kings, and I accepted that reality long ago." He turned to face her, his gray eyes steady despite the vulnerability beneath them. "But I find that these past 2 months, spent in your company, have shown me something I did not know I was missing. Something I am not certain I am prepared to simply set aside because my court expects otherwise." Illyra's breath caught in her throat. "Your Majesty." "Cale," he interrupted softly. "When we are alone, I would ask that you call me Cale." "Cale," she repeated, testing the name aloud, feeling the strange intimacy of it settle over her. "I don't know what to say to what you've just told me." "You needn't say anything," he assured her quickly, though the disappointment in his expression suggested otherwise. "I only wanted you to understand the truth of my thoughts, rather than leave you uncertain of where you stand with me. I know my position complicates whatever this has become between us. I know the expectations of my court weigh heavily against anything beyond simple gratitude for what you have given Edmund." He paused, his voice growing quieter still, "But I find myself unwilling to pretend that gratitude is the whole of what I feel." The silence that followed stretched long and charged, filled with everything neither of them had yet found the courage to fully name. Illyra thought of Bridget's warning, of the whispers already spreading through the castle, of the very real danger that came with a servant girl catching the attention of a king whose court expected strategic marriage above all else. But she thought, too, of the weeks spent in his company, of the careful, guarded man who had slowly revealed himself to be someone far gentler than his fearsome reputation suggested, someone who carried the weight of his kingdom and his guilt with a quiet strength that had, without her fully realizing it, begun to draw her toward him in ways that went far beyond simple curiosity. "I don't know what any of this means," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "For either of us. For Edmund. For the kingdom. If your court ever learned the full truth of what has been happening these past 2 months." "Neither do I," Cale admitted, crossing the room to stand closer to her than he ever had before. "But I find that I would rather face uncertainty with you beside me than certainty without you. That is a realization I did not expect to reach, Alira, and one I am not entirely sure what to do with." She looked up at him, at the storm-gray eyes that had once seemed so distant and forbidding, now softened by something that looked remarkably like hope, and felt the careful walls she had built around her own heart begin, slowly and dangerously, to crack. "We should be careful," she said, though the words carried none of the firmness she had intended. "We should," he agreed, though he made no move to step back, no move to reclaim the distance that had, over the past 2 months, steadily dissolved between them. "But I confess, I have grown tired of being careful with everything else in my life. I would like, just once, to allow myself something that is simply mine, uncomplicated by strategy, or duty, or the endless expectations of a crown I never fully wanted." The fire crackled softly in the hearth as they stood together in the quiet study, and Alira understood, with a clarity that both thrilled and terrified her, that whatever careful boundaries she had tried to maintain since that first chaotic night in the dungeon had, somewhere in the passing weeks, dissolved entirely, leaving her standing at the edge of something she could no longer pretend not to feel. 3 nights later, the castle hosted a formal gathering to welcome a delegation of visiting nobles from the northern provinces, a customary event meant to reinforce alliances and remind the kingdom's lesser lords of their loyalty to the crown. Alira had no place at such gatherings, of course, her duties keeping her far from the grand hall where nobles in silk and velvet exchanged pleasantries over roasted meats and fine wine. But she heard about it the next morning from one of the other kitchen girls, who could barely contain her excitement over the evening's gossip. Lady Vessa arrived early, the girl reported, practically breathless as she helped Alira carry trays of bread to the dining hall for the morning meal. You should have seen her, dressed finer than the visiting nobles themselves, positioning herself right beside the king's empty seat before the feast even began. Everyone says she means to be queen before the year is out. Alira's stomach twisted uncomfortably at the name, though she had never met the woman in question. She had heard whispers of Lady Vessa before, the daughter of a powerful noble family, whose lands bordered the kingdom's southern coast, a woman known throughout the court for her sharp ambition and her carefully cultivated favor with the king's council. "Did the king attend?" Alira asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "Late," the girl said, rolling her eyes, "and barely stayed an hour before excusing himself." Lady Vessa was furious, though she hid it well enough in front of the other nobles. "My cousin works in the laundry near the noble quarters, and she says Lady Vessa has been asking questions about the king's absences, about where he disappears to each evening." The warning settled uneasily in Alira's chest as she continued her morning duties, the weight of it following her through the rest of the day, like a shadow she could not quite shake. She had known, on some level, that whatever was growing between herself and Cale carried risks beyond the simple complications of rank and position, but hearing Lady Vessa's name spoken aloud, hearing confirmation that someone with real power and real ambition had begun asking pointed questions about the king's evenings, made the danger feel suddenly, uncomfortably real. That evening, when she arrived at Cale's study for her usual report, she found him already aware of the previous night's gathering, his expression troubled despite his attempts to mask it. "You heard about the feast," she said, settling into her now familiar chair. "I did not attend for long," he admitted, rubbing a hand across his tired eyes. Lady Vessa made her intentions rather clear, as she has done for some months now. "My council believes an alliance with her family would strengthen our southern borders considerably. They have not been subtle in their encouragement." "And what do you believe?" Alira asked carefully. Cale was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes distant, weighing thoughts he seemed reluctant to fully voice. I believe, he said finally, that I have spent 3 years allowing duty and guilt to dictate nearly every decision in my life, and I find myself, for the first time since my father's death, wanting something purely for myself, rather than for the kingdom's strategic advantage. That's not an answer to my question, Elira pointed out gently. A faint, tired smile crossed his face. No, I suppose it isn't. He met her eyes directly, the weight of his gaze carrying more honesty than she had expected. I do not want Lady Vessa, Elira. I have never wanted her, despite my council's persistent hopes. Whatever I am beginning to want, whatever this has become between us these past weeks, I find myself far more certain of than any strategic alliance my council could propose. The admission hung in the air between them, dangerous and thrilling in equal measure. Elira thought of Bridget's warning, of the kitchen girl's excited gossip, of Lady Vessa's sharp questions already circulating through the castle's laundry rooms and servants' quarters. Whatever careful discretion she and Cale had managed to maintain over the past 2 months was clearly beginning to fray at the edges, noticed by more eyes than either of them had accounted for. She'll come for me, Elira said quietly, the realization settling over her with sudden clarity. If she believes I stand between her and the crown, she won't simply stand aside and watch. I won't let anything happen to you, Cale said, his voice fierce with a protectiveness that startled them both. Whatever Lady Vessa attempts, whatever schemes her ambition drives her toward, I will not allow you to be harmed, because of feelings I have chosen to acknowledge rather than suppress. You can't protect me from everything, Elira said softly. Not from court politics, not from a noble woman with powerful allies, and a council eager to see her crowned. Cale crossed the room and knelt before her chair, an act of humility so unexpected from a king that Elira felt her breath catch in her throat. Then we will face it together, he said, taking her hands in his gray eyes steady and resolute. Whatever comes, Elira, I do not intend to face it alone, and I do not intend to let you face it alone either. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting warm light across the study, as the weight of his words settled between them, a promise neither of them fully understood the cost of yet, though both sensed, with growing certainty, that the quiet, careful world they had built together over the past 2 months was about to be tested in ways neither of them could fully predict. The days that followed carried a different quality than the quiet, comfortable weeks that had preceded them. Elira noticed the shift immediately, small but unmistakable, in the way certain servants watched her more closely as she moved through the castle's corridors, in the way conversations sometimes fell silent when she entered a room. Word had spread, as word always did within castle walls, and though no one spoke directly to her about it, she could feel the weight of the court's growing curiosity pressing in around her like a held breath. She continued her mornings with Edmund regardless, finding a steady comfort in the dungeon's quiet routine, even as the world above grew more complicated. The dragon had changed further in recent weeks, his golden eyes brighter, his movements quicker and more deliberate, as though whatever remained of the man trapped inside was slowly, painstakingly finding his way back toward the surface. You're getting stronger, she told him one morning, watching the way he shifted his enormous body with newfound ease, no longer the sluggish, defeated creature she had first encountered months ago. Something beyond just calmness. Edmund's golden eyes met hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw something flicker behind them, something more focused and present than the vague, patient awareness she had grown accustomed to. He lifted his head higher than usual, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, before making a low sound deep in his chest that seemed almost like an attempt at communication. I wish you could tell me what you're thinking, she murmured, reaching out to rest her palm against his warm scales. I wish I knew if we're actually getting closer to breaking whatever hold the curse still has on you, or if I'm simply imagining progress because I want so badly for this to work. She spent that morning as she always did, talking softly, sharing small stories, watching the subtle changes in his posture and expression that had become as familiar to her now as the lines of her own hands. But when she finally rose to leave, gathering her things in the flickering torchlight, Edmund did something he had never done before. He rose fully onto his feet, towering over her, and gently nudged her shoulder with his massive snout, guiding her back toward the bench she had just vacated. What is it? She asked, settling back down, watching him with careful attention. He moved toward the far corner of the chamber, where a small collection of loose stones had gathered over the years, near the base of the wall, displaced during his early desperate attempts to break free of his chains. Using one enormous claw, with a delicacy that seemed almost impossible for a creature of his size, he began scratching something into the soft dirt floor near the stones. Elira watched in stunned silence as rough shapes began to form beneath his claw, clumsy and uneven, but unmistakably deliberate. Letters, he was writing. She rose slowly and crossed the chamber, kneeling beside the marks he had made, her heart racing as she made out the crude, scratched word in the dirt. Thank you. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them, and she looked up at Edmund, whose golden gaze held hers with an intensity that confirmed everything she had hoped and doubted in equal measure over the past months. Somewhere inside that enormous, scaled body, the prince was still there, aware, present, and reaching toward her across whatever barrier the curse had built between them. You understand everything I've said to you, she whispered, this whole time. He made a low sound of confirmation, lowering his head to rest against the dirt floor beside the words he had written, and Elira reached out to press her palm against his scales, overwhelmed by the enormity of what she had just witnessed. Months of quiet, patient visits, of stories shared and comfort offered, without expectation of return, and here, finally, was proof that it had mattered, that Edmund had been present and aware through every moment of it, even trapped within a form that had denied him any way to respond until now. She rushed to tell Cale the moment her visit ended, finding him in his study reviewing correspondence with his usual focused intensity. He looked up the moment she entered, and whatever urgency showed on her face was enough to bring him immediately to his feet. What happened? Is he all right? He wrote to me, Elira said, breathless with the memory of it. In the dirt, with his claw. 2 words. Thank you. She watched Cale's expression shift from alarm to stunned disbelief. He understands everything, Cale. He's been aware this entire time, listening, and today he found a way to tell me. Cale crossed the room quickly, taking her hands in his gray eyes bright with an emotion so raw and unguarded that Elira felt her breath catch. 3 years, he said, his voice thick. 3 years, I have wondered whether any part of him still remained beneath that curse, whether the friend I knew was truly gone, or simply trapped beyond reach, and you have proven, in a matter of months, what I could not determine in all that time. We're not finished, Elira reminded him gently, though hope had begun to bloom warmly in her own chest as well. This is progress, real progress, but the curse itself hasn't broken. He's still trapped in that form. I know, Cale said, though the joy in his expression did not fully dim. But it means we are on the right path. It means whatever you are doing, whatever connection you have built with him these past months, is genuinely working toward breaking the curse, the old text described. He squeezed her hands gently. I want to go to him. Now, if you'll accompany me. They descended together into the dungeon, and when Edmund's golden eyes found Cale standing beside Elira, something in the great creature's posture shifted, straightening with an alertness that had been entirely absent during Cale's earlier, guilt-laden visits. Cale knelt beside the words scratched into the dirt floor, tracing his fingers over the rough letters with something close to reverence. I am sorry, old friend, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years of guilt he had never fully allowed himself to release. For every day this curse has held you, for every year it took me to find someone who could reach past it. I should have searched harder. I should have found her sooner. Edmund lowered his head and pressed it gently against Cale's shoulder, exactly as he had during their previous visit together, and Elira watched the two friends reunite across the strange barrier of curse and scale, and years lost to circumstances neither of them had chosen. When Edmund finally lifted his head, he turned his attention back to the dirt floor, and with careful, deliberate strokes of his claw, scratched out several more words beneath the first message. Not your fault. Cale's composure finally broke at that, a rough sound escaping him that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and he pressed his forehead briefly against Edmund's scaled snout, the two of them sharing a moment of connection that Elira felt almost like an intrusion to witness, though neither of them seemed to mind her presence. We're going to fix this, Cale said finally, straightening and wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed but unashamed of the emotion he had shown. Whatever it takes, However long it requires, we are going to break this curse and bring you home, Edmund. I swear it. Edmund's golden eyes shifted between Chaol and Alira, and though he had no way to smile, no human features left to convey the fullness of what he clearly felt in that moment. Something in his posture, in the warmth radiating from his enormous body, communicated gratitude and hope in equal measure. That evening, as Alira made her way back toward the servants' quarters, her mind still spinning with the events of the day, she found her path blocked by a figure she did not recognize, standing at the intersection of two corridors, with the deliberate patience of someone who had been waiting specifically for her. The woman was striking, dressed in fine silk despite the late hour, her dark hair elaborately styled, her expression carrying the polished, calculated pleasantness of someone accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted, through careful manipulation, rather than open confrontation. "You must be Alira," the woman said, her voice smooth and cool. "I've heard a great deal about you these past weeks. I am Lady Vessa. I believe it's time the two of us had a conversation." Alira's pulse quickened, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, remembering the whispered warnings she had heard about this woman's ambition and influence. "Lady Vessa," she acknowledged with a small, respectful bow, uncertain what protocol demanded, but unwilling to appear disrespectful before someone with such considerable power at court. "I wasn't aware you knew my name." "The entire castle knows your name now," Vessa said, her smile never wavering, though something sharp glittered behind her dark eyes. "The servant girl who tamed the king's dragon, the servant girl who now spends her evenings closeted away in the king's private study. Word travels quickly within these walls, as I'm sure you've noticed." "I only do as the king requests," Alira said carefully. "My duties concern the dragon's care, nothing more." "Of course," Vessa said, though her tone suggested she believed nothing of the sort. She stepped closer, her silk gown whispering against the stone floor, studying Alira with the calculating attention of a woman accustomed to assessing threats and opportunities alike. "You're quite lovely, I'll admit, in a plain, common sort of way. I can understand why a king might find such simplicity refreshing, after years surrounded by court sophistication. But I wonder if you fully understand the position you've placed yourself in." "I haven't placed myself anywhere," Alira said, though she felt the ground shifting beneath the conversation's polite surface, sensing the threat coiled beneath Vessa's smooth, measured words. "I care for a creature no one else could approach. That is the whole of my involvement here." "Is it?" Vessa's smile sharpened at the edges. "Because I've heard rather different accounts from the household staff. Extended evening meetings, private conversations, a king who has grown suddenly, curiously distracted from the matters of state and marriage that ought to command his full attention." She circled Alira slowly, the way a predator might study prey, before deciding whether the effort of pursuit was worthwhile. "I have spent 3 years cultivating the favor of this court, Alira, building the alliances and relationships necessary to secure a position that has long been understood to belong to someone of proper birth and standing. I would hate for a passing infatuation, however charming the king might currently find it, to disrupt plans that have been carefully laid for far longer than you have even known his name." "I have no intention of disrupting anything," Alira said, keeping her voice steady, despite the fear coiling tighter in her chest with every word. "Whatever the king chooses to do with his evenings is his own affair, not mine to control or claim credit for." "How refreshingly modest," Vessa said, though the compliment carried no warmth. "I do hope that modesty extends to recognizing the limits of your position here, before circumstances force a more direct reminder." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to something quieter, more dangerous than the polished pleasantness she had maintained until now. "Kings are permitted their diversions, Alira. Servant girls who catch a king's passing fancy are rarely remembered fondly, once that fancy has run its course, and they are remembered even less fondly by the woman who eventually claims the crown that was always destined to be hers." The threat hung unmistakable in the air between them, and Alira felt her chest tighten with a fear that went beyond simple court politics, a fear rooted in the very real power this woman clearly wielded, the very real danger she represented to anything Alira had begun to build with Chaol, and to Edmund's fragile, hard-won progress toward reclaiming his humanity. "I understand you clearly, Lady Vessa," Alira said finally, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the tremor she felt beneath it. "I hoped you might," Vessa said, straightening and smoothing her silk skirts with an air of satisfaction, as though the conversation had gone precisely as she intended. It would be such a shame if a simple kitchen girl found herself caught up in matters far beyond her understanding, matters that could prove considerably more dangerous than tending to a chained beast in the castle's dungeons. She offered one final, cold smile before turning to leave. Do think carefully about your position here, Alira. Some ambitions are simply too costly to pursue, no matter how genuine the feelings behind them might be. Alira stood frozen in the corridor long after Vessa's footsteps had faded into the castle's shadows, her heart pounding with a fear she had not fully anticipated, despite the warnings she had already heard whispered through the kitchens and laundry rooms. This was no longer simply a matter of court gossip or curious servants speculating about the king's evening habits. Lady Vessa had made her intentions unmistakably clear, and the calculated danger beneath her polished words left no doubt that she would not hesitate to act against anyone she perceived as standing between herself and the crown she believed was rightfully hers. That night, Alira lay awake long after the other servant girls had fallen asleep, staring up at the shadowed ceiling, turning over every word of the confrontation in her mind. She thought of Cale's promise to protect her, of Edmund's hard-won progress toward breaking his curse, of the fragile, hopeful world they had all begun building together over the past months, and wondered, with a growing sense of dread, whether Lady Vessa's ambition might prove powerful enough to shatter it all before it had truly begun. She did not tell Cale about the confrontation with Lady Vessa, not immediately. Some instinct told her that revealing the encounter too soon might provoke a reaction from him that could make matters worse, might draw even more attention to a relationship they had barely begun to navigate themselves. Instead, she carried the weight of the threat quietly, letting it settle into the careful vigilance she now brought to her daily movements through the castle. But keeping such things hidden had never been Alira's strength, and within days, Cale noticed the change in her demeanor, the way she flinched slightly at unexpected footsteps in the corridor, the way her attention seemed to drift during their evening conversations, distracted by thoughts she clearly did not want to voice. "Something is troubling you," he observed one evening, setting aside the reports he had been reviewing to study her more carefully. "You've barely spoken since you arrived tonight." "It's nothing," Alira said, though the lie felt heavy on her tongue, and Cale's sharp gray eyes made it clear he did not believe her for a moment. "Alira," his voice carried a gentle firmness that left little room for evasion. "I have come to know you well enough these past months to recognize when something weighs on you. Please, tell me what has happened." She hesitated a moment longer before finally relenting, recounting the confrontation with Lady Vessa in careful detail, watching the way Cale's expression darkened with each word, his jaw tightening, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "She threatened you," he said, his voice low and dangerous, in a way Alira had never heard from him before. A reminder, sudden and sharp, of the formidable Alpha King his court both feared and depended upon. She was careful with her words, Alira said, though she could not deny the truth of what had happened. But yes, the meaning was unmistakable. Cale rose from his desk, pacing the length of his study with barely contained fury, his usual careful composure fractured by the protective anger surging through him. "I should have anticipated this," he said, more to himself than to Alira. "I knew Vessa's ambition ran deep, but I did not expect her to move against you so directly, so soon." "What will you do?" Alira asked, watching him carefully. "I will speak with her," Cale said, though the tightness in his jaw suggested the conversation would be far from pleasant. "I will make it unmistakably clear that any threat against you will not be tolerated, regardless of her family's standing or her influence within my council." "That might only make things worse," Alira cautioned. "If she believes I have your protection, if she believes I represent a genuine obstacle to her ambitions, rather than a passing fancy, she may become more careful, more calculated, in whatever she chooses to do next." Cale stopped his pacing, turning to look at her with an expression that mixed frustration, with grudging acknowledgement of her point. "You may be right," he admitted. "Court politics rarely reward direct confrontation. Vessa has spent years cultivating alliances within my council, relationships I cannot simply dismiss without risking broader instability within the kingdom." He ran a hand through his dark hair, clearly wrestling with the weight of competing responsibilities. "But I will not simply allow her to threaten you, and do nothing in response, Alira. That is not a compromise I am willing to accept. Then perhaps, Elira suggested carefully, the answer lies not in confronting her directly, but in ensuring my position here is not as vulnerable as she believes it to be. Cale studied her for a long moment, something calculating entering his gray eyes as he considered her words. What are you suggesting? I don't fully know, Elira admitted. But if Lady Vessa believes I am simply a servant girl with no protection beyond your passing favor, she will continue to see me as an obstacle easily removed. Perhaps there is a way to change that perception, without provoking the kind of direct confrontation that might destabilize your counsel's confidence. Cale crossed the room slowly, settling into the chair beside hers rather than his usual place behind the desk, an act of deliberate closeness that spoke to the seriousness of the conversation unfolding between them. I have been considering something, he said carefully, for some weeks now, though I confess I have hesitated to voice it, uncertain whether the timing was right, whether you would even welcome such a suggestion, given everything else weighing on us both. What is it? Edmund's progress, Cale said, the words he scratched into the dirt, the clear awareness and gratitude he has shown toward you these past months. They represent something remarkable, something that could shift the entire understanding of your position within this court, if presented correctly. He met her eyes directly. You are not simply a servant who happened to calm a dangerous beast, Elira. You are the one person in 3 years who has made genuine progress toward breaking an ancient curse that has haunted this kingdom's closest ally. That is not a small thing. That is not something easily dismissed by court politics, regardless of how ambitious Lady Vessa might be. You want to make it known publicly, Elira said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. Not entirely, not yet, Cale clarified. The full truth of Edmund's identity remains dangerous knowledge, particularly given the delicate peace between our kingdoms. But perhaps a partial truth, carefully presented to my council, acknowledging your role in managing what they believe to be simply a dangerous creature, might elevate your standing enough to discourage further threats from Lady Vessa or anyone else who might see you as vulnerable. Elira considered this carefully, weighing the risks against the potential protection such a strategy might offer. And if your counsel asks questions you cannot fully answer, if they press for details about why a servant girl has succeeded where trained handlers and healers failed. I will manage my counsel, Cale said, with a confidence that reminded Elira, not for the first time, of the formidable ruler, capable of holding an entire kingdom's loyalty, despite fear and uncertainty. That is precisely what I am trained to do, Elira. Let me carry that particular burden, while you focus on the work that matters most, the work only you can accomplish. She nodded slowly, though uncertainty still lingered in her chest. And Lady Vessa? Even with your counsel's acknowledgement, do you truly believe she will simply abandon her ambitions? Cale's expression turned grim. No, he admitted. I do not believe Vessa abandons anything easily. But perhaps, if her path forward becomes more complicated, more costly to her family's standing, should she continue pressing against you directly, she may reconsider the wisdom of open confrontation in favor of subtler approaches. He reached out, taking her hand in his, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the hard determination in his eyes moments before. Whatever she chooses, Elira, know that I will not allow her ambition to cost you your safety. That is a promise I intend to keep, regardless of what it requires of me. The warmth of his hand around hers, the fierce protectiveness in his voice, settled some of the fear that had lingered in her chest since the confrontation in the corridor, though a quiet unease remained, a sense that Lady Vessa's ambition ran deeper and more dangerous than either of them had yet fully accounted for. Over the following days, Cale moved carefully to elevate Elira's standing within the court, presenting her role in managing the castle's dangerous creature as a matter of significant achievement, worthy of formal recognition. He assigned her a small private chamber, separate from the crowded servants' quarters, and increased her modest wages to reflect what he described publicly as specialized duties, requiring particular skill and courage. The council, though clearly curious about the full details behind such unusual attention, accepted his explanations with the practiced deference expected of advisors serving a king known for decisive, often unquestionable judgment. Elira noticed the shift in how the household staff treated her almost immediately, a mixture of newfound respect and lingering suspicion, as though the servants could sense, even without full understanding, that something significant had changed in her position within the castle's careful hierarchy. Bridget, in particular, watched the developments with a wary, protective concern that softened only slightly when Alira assured her, as best she could without revealing the full truth, that the king's attention came with his genuine respect rather than mere passing fancy. Lady Vessa, for her part, made no further direct approach, though Alira caught her sharp, calculating gaze more than once across the castle's grand hall during formal gatherings, a silent acknowledgement that the confrontation between them, however quiet it remained on the surface, was far from finished. The woman's ambition had not diminished, Alira understood with growing certainty, only retreated into more careful, more patient calculation, waiting for an opportunity that would not draw the king's direct protective attention. Meanwhile, Edmund's progress continued steadily, each visit revealing small, encouraging signs of the man reclaiming himself from beneath the curse's grip. He had begun scratching short messages into the dirt floor regularly now, simple observations, occasional questions about the world beyond his chamber, small fragments of the person he had been before the sorcerer's curse had stolen his form and his voice alike. Cale joined these visits more frequently as well, and the three of them settled into a quiet, hopeful rhythm that felt, for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, like something approaching genuine peace. But peace, as Alira was beginning to understand within the complicated world of castle politics and ancient curses, rarely lasted without challenge, and somewhere beyond the walls of Draveth Castle, forces were already stirring that would test everything she and Cale had carefully built together, in ways none of them could yet fully anticipate. 3 weeks after the council's formal acknowledgement of Alira's new standing, a messenger arrived at Draveth Castle, bearing news that sent a ripple of unease through the entire household. Cale summoned Alira to his study within the hour, his expression grave as he stood over a fresh scroll bearing the seal of Calderwyn, the kingdom beyond the eastern mountains where Edmund's family still ruled. "What is it?" Alira asked, crossing the room quickly at the sight of his troubled expression. "Calderwyn's new king has requested a formal audience," Cale said, setting down the scroll with careful precision, as though handling something far more volatile than parchment and ink. Edmund's older brother, Garrett, ascended the throne 2 years ago, after their father's death. He has ruled cautiously since then, maintaining the peace between our kingdoms, without ever fully addressing what happened to his younger brother during the final year of the war. "Does he know what became of Edmund?" Alira asked carefully. "He knows Edmund vanished during a diplomatic meeting that ended in chaos," Cale said. "Beyond that, the official accounts remain vague, deliberately so, to protect the fragile peace between our kingdoms. I have always assumed Garrett suspected there was more to the story than what was reported, but he has never pressed the matter directly, until now." "Why now?" Cale's jaw tightened. The message doesn't say explicitly, only that matters of great importance to both kingdoms require discussion, and that he intends to travel to Draveth personally within the month to address them. He looked up at her, worry etched clearly across his features. "I fear Garrett may have finally learned something of the truth, Alira. Whether through old rumors reaching Calderwyn's court, or through some source closer to home, I cannot say. But this request feels far too pointed to be simple diplomatic courtesy." The implications settled heavily over Alira as she considered what a formal visit from Calderwyn's king might mean for the fragile situation they had all worked so carefully to protect. If Garrett arrived suspecting the truth about his brother's fate, if he discovered that Edmund had spent 3 years chained beneath Draveth Castle, rather than lost to the chaos of war as the official accounts suggested, the consequences could prove catastrophic, both for the peace between their kingdoms, and for Edmund himself, whose continued survival, however cursed and transformed, might be seen by a grieving, suspicious brother as evidence of concealment rather than protection. "We need to accelerate our efforts," Alira said finally, her mind already racing through the implications. "If there's any possibility of breaking the curse before Garrett arrives, we should pursue it with everything we have." Presenting him with his brother restored, rather than trapped in a form he might view as monstrous, could change everything about how this visit unfolds. "A month is not a great deal of time," Cale said, though something in his expression suggested he had already been considering the same possibility. "But you have made more progress with Edmund in these past months than 3 years of searching accomplished. Perhaps it is enough." They agreed to increase the frequency of Alira's visits, spending not only mornings but often long afternoons in Edmund's chamber, searching for whatever final piece remained to complete whatever transformation the curse required. Edmund's messages in the dirt grew longer and more complex with each passing day, revealing glimpses of the thoughtful, gentle man he had been before the sorcerer's magic had stolen his form, a man who clearly remembered his brother with genuine affection, despite the years of separation and suffering. "Garrett worries too much," Edmund scratched into the dirt one afternoon, when Alira mentioned the approaching visit. "Always did, even as boys. He will be angry, but not at you, at the sorcerer, at our father's war." "I hope you're right," Alira said, settling beside him on the familiar stone bench. "Cale fears he'll see this as concealment, as though we've been hiding you rather than protecting you." Edmund's golden eyes studied her for a long moment before he scratched another message into the soft earth. "Tell Cale I remember everything, every visit, every kindness. Garrett will understand when he sees the truth of what you've both done." The reassurance offered some comfort, though the weight of the approaching visit continued to press against the careful peace they had built over the preceding months. Alira found herself working with renewed urgency, spending every available hour with Edmund, searching through old texts alongside Cale, late into the evening, hoping desperately to find whatever final key might complete the curse's undoing, before Calderwin's king arrived, to demand answers neither of them felt fully prepared to give. Lady Vessa, ever attentive to shifts within the court's careful balance of power, seemed to sense the growing tension surrounding the king's private affairs, though she made no further direct move against Alira in the weeks that followed. Instead, Alira noticed her presence more frequently at council meetings, her voice growing louder and more insistent in matters concerning the kingdom's relationship with Calderwin, positioning herself, Alira suspected, to appear indispensable to whatever diplomatic crisis might unfold when Garrett's visit finally arrived. "She's preparing for something," Alira warned Cale one evening, as they reviewed yet another ancient text that had yielded no useful insight into breaking Edmund's curse. "I don't know what exactly, but her sudden interest in Calderwin affairs feels far too convenient to be coincidence." "I've noticed the same," Cale admitted, rubbing tired eyes as he set aside the useless scroll. "I suspect she hopes to position herself as essential to whatever resolution emerges from Garrett's visit, perhaps hoping the crisis will remind my council of the value in securing alliances through proper marriage, rather than whatever unconventional path I have chosen these past months." He glanced at Alira, something rueful in his tired smile. "She is not wrong to sense opportunity and uncertainty, even if her methods trouble me." "What if we can't break the curse before he arrives?" Alira asked, voicing the fear that had been building steadily in her chest as the weeks passed, without the breakthrough they so desperately needed. "What if Garrett arrives and finds his brother still trapped, still chained beneath your castle, no closer to freedom than he was 3 years ago?" Cale was quiet for a long moment, weighing the question with the careful gravity it deserved. "Then we tell him the truth," he said finally. "All of it, the war, the sorcerer's curse, the 3 years I spent searching for any way to help his brother, and the progress you have made these past months, progress no one else managed to achieve." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his with quiet reassurance. "Garrett is not his father, Alira. I have to believe that whatever anger or grief he carries, he will recognize the truth of what we have tried to do, even if we have not yet succeeded fully. And if you're wrong, then we face whatever consequences follow," Cale said simply, "together, as we have faced everything else these past months." His gray eyes held hers steadily, carrying a quiet strength that had, over the course of their growing closeness, become as familiar and comforting to her as Edmund's patient golden gaze. "I will not abandon Edmund to face his brother's judgment alone, and I will not abandon you to face Lady Vessa's ambitions alone either. Whatever comes, Alira, we meet it together." The weeks continued to pass with steady, careful progress, though the final breakthrough they sought remained frustratingly elusive, hovering just beyond reach despite every effort they poured into finding it. And as the day of Garrett's arrival drew steadily closer, the quiet, hopeful world Alira and Cale had built together over the preceding months braced itself for a test that would prove, in ways none of them could yet fully anticipate, just how strong the foundations of their fragile new peace truly were. King Garrett of Calderwin arrived at Draveth Castle on a gray morning 3 weeks later. his procession winding through the eastern gates with the careful, measured formality of a monarch determined to project strength despite the uncertain purpose of his visit. Elira watched from a high window as the delegation entered the courtyard below, noting the resemblance between Garrett and the brother she had come to know so intimately through months of quiet conversation. The same dark hair, the same proud bearing, though Garrett's face carried none of the gentle warmth she had glimpsed in Edmund's scratched messages and patient golden eyes. The formal reception that followed stretched through the better part of the afternoon, filled with the careful pleasantries and diplomatic maneuvering that Elira had no part in, her position within the castle still far removed from the grand hall where kings and nobles exchanged guarded words over feast tables. She spent the hours instead with Edmund, sensing his own tension building, as the reality of his brother's presence within the castle walls settled over him. "He is here," Edmund scratched into the dirt, his claw moving with more agitation than she had seen from him in weeks. "I can feel it, somehow, the weight of his presence in this castle." "Are you frightened?" Elira asked gently, settling beside him with her usual quiet patience. "Not of him," Edmund wrote. "Of what he might think, seeing me like this. Of what it might mean for the peace between our kingdoms, if he believes Cale has concealed something shameful, rather than protected something precious." "Cale would never think of you as shameful," Elira assured him. "And I don't believe your brother will either, once he understands the full truth." Edmund's golden eyes held hers for a long moment before he scratched one final message into the soft earth. "I hope you are right, for all our sakes." That evening, Cale summoned Elira to his study earlier than usual, his expression carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent hours navigating careful diplomatic conversation while concealing a truth far more significant than anything discussed openly at the feast table. "He suspects something," Cale said without preamble, pacing the length of his study with restless energy. He asked pointed questions about Edmund's fate throughout the entire reception. Careful questions dressed in diplomatic language, but questions nonetheless. "I believe he has heard rumors, perhaps from merchants who travel between our kingdoms, perhaps from some other source I cannot identify, but rumors substantial enough to bring him here personally, rather than simply sending another diplomatic envoy." "What did you tell him?" Elira asked. "As little as I could manage without appearing evasive," Cale admitted. "I deflected where possible, offered vague reassurances about ongoing efforts to locate information regarding what happened during that final meeting, but I could see in his eyes that he did not fully believe me." He stopped his pacing, turning to face her directly. "He has requested a private audience tomorrow morning, away from the formal court, where he intends, in his words, to discuss matters requiring complete honesty between old allies." The weight of what tomorrow's conversation might require settled heavily between them. "You'll have to tell him the truth," Elira said quietly. "There's no way to maintain the deception any longer. Not if he's already suspicious enough to press for private conversation." "I know," Cale said, running a hand through his dark hair with visible exhaustion. "I have spent the entire evening trying to determine the best way to present everything. The war, the curse, the years I spent searching for a way to help Edmund, the progress we have made together these past months. But I fear that regardless of how carefully I frame the truth, Garrett's first response will be fury, perhaps grief, and I cannot predict what either might drive him to do." "Whatever happens," Elira said, reaching out to still his restless movement with a gentle hand against his arm, "you're not facing this alone. I'll be there, if you want me to be." And Edmund's own words, the progress he's made, the awareness he's shown, those things speak for themselves in ways that no explanation from either of us could fully capture. Cale covered her hand with his own, some of the tension easing from his shoulders at her steady presence. "I would be grateful for your presence tomorrow, Elira, more than you know. Garrett needs to understand, not simply what happened to his brother, but what has been done these past months to help him. I believe your role in that story matters more than anything I could say on my own." They spent the remainder of the evening preparing for the difficult conversation ahead, reviewing the ancient texts once more for any final insight that might strengthen their position, discussing carefully how much of the truth to reveal, and in what order, hoping to present the situation in a way that emphasized hope and progress, rather than 3 years of concealment and suffering. But even as they planned, a quiet unease lingered beneath their careful preparations, an awareness that tomorrow's conversation held the power to either strengthen the fragile peace they had built, or shatter it entirely. Depending on how Garrett chose to receive the truth, they could no longer keep hidden. Elsewhere in the castle, Lady Vessa moved through the evening's remaining festivities with sharp, calculating attention, gathering fragments of information from careful conversations with visiting Calderwyn nobles, piecing together enough of the situation's shape to sense a genuine opportunity forming within the uncertainty surrounding Garrett's visit. She had waited patiently for weeks, watching Alira's position strengthen under the king's careful protection, searching for whatever weakness might finally allow her to reclaim the advantage she had lost since that confrontation in the castle corridor. Now, with Calderwyn's king arriving under mysterious circumstances, with whispers of some hidden truth involving the king's chained beast circulating even among visiting nobles, Vessa sensed the pieces of a far more significant opportunity beginning to align. If the truth about Edmund proved as scandalous as she suspected, if Chaol's careful concealment threatened the fragile peace between kingdoms, the resulting crisis might prove powerful enough to unseat not only Alira's newfound protection, but perhaps Chaol's judgment itself, in the eyes of a council already uncertain about his unconventional recent choices. She retired to her chambers that night, with careful calculation, replacing her earlier frustration, already planning how best to position herself when tomorrow's private audience between the two kings inevitably became public knowledge. As such, significant secrets rarely remained contained within castle walls for long. Whatever truth emerged from that private conversation, Lady Vessa intended to ensure it served her own ambitions, regardless of the cost to anyone who stood in her way. Morning arrived with a heavy gray sky that seemed to mirror the tension gathering within Dravith Castle's walls. Alira dressed carefully, choosing the simple but well-made garments Chaol had arranged for her since her elevation in standing, and made her way to the private council chamber, where the audience with King Garrett had been arranged, her stomach tight with nervous anticipation. Chaol waited near the chamber's entrance, his usual composed authority visible, despite the tightness around his eyes that spoke to a sleepless night spent preparing for this conversation. He offered Alira a brief, grateful nod as she approached, and together they entered the chamber, where Garrett already sat, his expression carefully neutral in the manner of a man who had spent years learning to conceal his true feelings behind diplomatic composure. "Your Majesty," Chaol began, taking his seat across the table from his fellow king, "thank you for agreeing to speak with me privately. I understand you have questions regarding events from the final year of the war." Garrett's dark eyes flickered briefly toward Alira before returning to Chaol, a silent question passing between them regarding her presence in what he had presumably expected to be a conversation between kings alone. "I have many questions," he said, his voice carrying the same measured control Alira had noted throughout the previous day's formal reception. "Questions I have carried for 3 years, since my brother vanished during what was supposed to be a simple diplomatic meeting between old friends. I trust the presence of your companion here indicates you finally intend to answer them honestly." "She is essential to what I need to tell you," Chaol said carefully, "perhaps more essential than I am myself, in truth." Garrett's jaw tightened, impatience beginning to crack through his careful composure. "Then speak plainly, Chaol. I have waited 3 years for honest answers. I do not intend to wait through careful diplomatic evasion any longer." Chaol took a steadying breath, and then, with a directness that Alira admired despite the difficulty of the words he had to speak, told Garrett everything. The war his father had begun, the secret meetings he and Edmund had arranged, hoping to negotiate peace despite their father's ambitions. The sorcerer's sudden brutal curse that had transformed Edmund before either of them fully understood what was happening. The 3 years spent searching desperately for any way to reverse what had been done, and the servant girl whose unexpected connection with the cursed creature had finally offered genuine hope where every other effort had failed. Garrett's composure shattered somewhere in the middle of the account, his careful diplomatic mask giving way to raw grief and fury in equal measure. He rose from his seat, pacing the chamber with barely contained emotion, his voice rising as he demanded to know why Chaol had not sent word to Calderwyn the moment the curse had been discovered, why 3 years had been allowed to pass with Edmund's fate concealed behind vague, evasive diplomatic language. "You let me believe he was dead," Rhett said, his voice thick with anguish. "Or worse, that he had been captured and tortured by enemies unknown, lost somewhere beyond any hope of rescue. 3 years, Chaol. 3 years I have grieved a brother who was alive this entire time, chained beneath your own castle, and you said nothing." I feared what revealing the truth might mean, Cale admitted, his own composure fracturing beneath the weight of Garrett's justified anger. For the fragile peace between our kingdoms, still recovering from a war that cost both our people so much. I feared what your father, had he lived, might have done with such knowledge. I feared, if I am fully honest, what you yourself might do, discovering your brother, trapped in a form that could easily be mistaken for monstrous rather than tragic. He met Garrett's furious gaze, steadily, despite the difficulty of the moment. I know now that fear was wrong. I should have trusted you with the truth from the beginning, regardless of the risks. That failure rests entirely on my shoulders, and I do not ask for your forgiveness, only your understanding of the impossible position I found myself in. Garrett's fury did not fully dissipate, but something in Cale's raw honesty seemed to reach him despite the depth of his justified grievance. He turned finally to Elira, studying her with the same careful attention he had shown throughout the previous day's reception, though now colored by a desperate hope he could not fully suppress. You have made progress, he said, his voice quieter now, though still tight with emotion. Cale claims you have succeeded, where 3 years of searching failed. Is this true? Edmund is aware, Elira said carefully, meeting the grieving king's gaze directly. He understands everything spoken to him, and in recent weeks he has found a way to communicate, scratching messages into the dirt floor of his chamber. He remembers you, your majesty. He speaks of you with genuine affection, despite everything that has happened. Garrett's breath caught audibly at this confirmation, his careful composure cracking further beneath the weight of hope he had clearly not allowed himself to feel in 3 long years of assumed loss. I want to see him, he said, his voice rough. Now, if such a thing is possible. Of course, Cale said immediately, rising from his seat. I should have suggested it myself. Come, both of you. Let us go to him together. They descended into the dungeon, in tense silence, Garrett's steps quickening, with barely restrained urgency, as they approached the familiar chamber, where Edmund waited. When his golden eyes fell upon his brother standing at the entrance, something in the great creature's posture shifted immediately, straightening with an alertness and eagerness that confirmed, beyond any doubt, the recognition and affection Elira had described. Garrett froze at the sight of him, his composure finally breaking entirely, as tears filled his eyes, staring at the enormous scaled creature that had once been his younger brother, seeing past the monstrous form, to the awareness and warmth visible in those familiar golden eyes. Edmund, he whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. The dragon lowered his massive head, closing the distance between them with careful gentleness, and pressed his snout against his brother's chest, in a gesture so tender that Elira felt tears prick at her own eyes, watching the reunion unfold after 3 long years of separation and assumed loss. Garrett wrapped his arms around his brother's scaled neck as best he could manage, his shoulders shaking with barely contained emotion, and for a long moment, the chamber held nothing but the quiet, profound relief of 2 brothers reunited against every terrible odds that had separated them. When Garrett finally stepped back, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand, he turned to Cale and Elira with an expression that had transformed entirely from the fury he had shown moments before. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Both of you. I do not know what path led to this moment, what sacrifice and effort brought my brother even this small measure back to himself. But I understand now that I owe you both a debt I cannot easily repay. We haven't finished, Elira reminded him gently. The curse itself remains unbroken. Edmund is still trapped in this form. But you have hope, Garrett said, something fierce and determined entering his grieving expression. You have made progress no one else managed in 3 years. That alone gives me reason to believe this curse can be fully broken, given enough time, and enough of whatever remarkable connection you share with my brother. He looked between Elira and Cale, with new understanding dawning in his tired eyes. Whatever assistance Calderwin can offer toward that end, scholars, ancient texts, resources beyond what Draveth alone possesses, you have only to ask. My brother's freedom is worth more to me than any lingering grievance over 3 years of silence, however painful that silence has been to bear. The relief that settled over the chamber felt almost tangible, the weight of months of careful concealment and fear finally beginning to lift, as an unexpected ally emerged from what had threatened to become a devastating confrontation. But even as hope bloomed brighter than it had in months, Elira could not shake a lingering unease, an awareness that Lady Vessa's careful calculation continued somewhere within the castle's shadows, waiting for whatever opportunity this unexpected alliance between kingdoms might yet provide. In the weeks that followed Garrett's emotional reunion with his brother, Draveth Castle settled into an uneasy but hopeful rhythm. Calderwyn scholars arrived within days, bringing with them ancient texts and knowledge that Chaol's own library had lacked, and Alira found herself spending long hours poring over translated passages alongside these visiting experts, searching for whatever final piece might complete the curse's undoing. The scholars confirmed much of what Chaol had already discovered, that the curse required an act of selfless devotion to break fully, but they added crucial detail that had been missing from Draveth's older, incomplete texts. The devotion required was not simply kindness or care, but something the ancient language described as a binding choice, a moment where the person offering their care chose the cursed individual's well-being over their own safety or advantage, knowingly and without hesitation, even when the cost of that choice remained uncertain. "You have already shown him kindness," one of the Calderwyn scholars explained to Alira during a long afternoon session in the castle library. An elderly woman named Agnes, whose knowledge of old magic exceeded anyone else's within either kingdom. But kindness alone, however genuine, may not be sufficient. The old texts suggest the curse requires a moment of true sacrifice, a choice made when something significant stands to be lost. "What kind of sacrifice?" Alira asked, though a cold uncertainty had already begun settling in her stomach at the implications of the scholar's words. "That, I cannot say with certainty," Agnes admitted. "The old language is frustratingly vague on specifics, though it suggests the moment will present itself naturally, born from genuine circumstance, rather than something that can be manufactured or forced." She studied Alira with careful, knowing eyes. "You will recognize it, I suspect, when it arrives. Such moments rarely announce themselves clearly beforehand." The uncertainty of this revelation weighed heavily on Alira as the days passed, though she continued her regular visits with Edmund, hoping that whatever moment the ancient text described might eventually present itself through their continued closeness. Edmund himself seemed to sense the shift in her demeanor, his messages in the dirt growing more curious about her worries, though she found herself hesitant to burden him with uncertainty about a sacrifice neither of them could yet fully understand. Meanwhile, her relationship with Chaol continued to deepen in ways that felt both natural and increasingly difficult to conceal from the wider court, despite the careful discretion they both attempted to maintain. Their evening conversations in his study had become something neither of them could imagine their days without, filled with an easy intimacy that had grown steadily from those first careful, guarded exchanges months earlier. One evening, as autumn settled fully over the kingdom, and the first cold winds began sweeping through the castle's high towers, Chaol surprised her by suggesting they walk together in the castle gardens, rather than remaining confined to his study, a small act of boldness that carried its own quiet significance, given how carefully they had both worked to keep their growing closeness from becoming public spectacle. "Are you certain this is wise?" Alira asked, though she found herself unable to refuse the offer, drawn by the rare opportunity to simply enjoy his company, without the weight of curses and court politics pressing constantly against their conversations. "Probably not," Chaol admitted, a rare, genuine smile crossing his usually guarded features. "But I find myself increasingly tired of caution, Alira. These past months have taught me that life offers few enough moments of genuine happiness to justify squandering them out of fear, for what others might think." They walked together beneath the bare branches of the garden's ancient trees, the evening air crisp and cold, the sky above scattered with the first bright stars of the coming night. Chaol spoke of his childhood, of memories from before the war had claimed his father and burdened him with a crown he had never fully wanted, memories of adventures shared with Edmund before everything had changed between their kingdoms. "I used to imagine," he admitted quietly, as they paused beside a small stone fountain that had long since run dry with the season's cold, "that I might someday have a life beyond duty and obligation. Something simpler. Something chosen freely rather than inherited through circumstance." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes soft in the fading evening light. "I did not expect to find that possibility again, not after everything the war took from me. But these past months, with you, I have begun to believe it might still be possible after all." "Chaol," Alira began, uncertain how to respond to the vulnerability in his words, though her heart raced with an emotion she had been carefully guarding against, fully acknowledging for weeks now. "I know the complications," he continued, before she could finish, his voice gentle but earnest. "I know what my council expects, what Lady Vessa continues to hope for, what the whole weight of Draveth's political future seems to demand of me. But I find that none of those considerations matter as much to me as they once did, not when weighed against what I feel when I am with you." He reached out, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering against her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "I love you, Alira. I have known it for some weeks now, though I have hesitated to speak the words aloud, uncertain whether such a declaration would only complicate matters further, given everything else we have both been navigating. But standing here tonight, I find I can no longer keep such an important truth hidden, regardless of the complications it might bring." The words settled over her like warmth spreading through cold hands, and Alira felt her own careful guard finally crumbling entirely beneath the weight of everything she had been feeling, but had not yet allowed herself to fully name. "I love you too," she admitted softly, the words carrying a relief and joy she had not expected to feel so completely. "I have for longer than I've been willing to admit, even to myself." Cale's expression transformed with such genuine, unguarded happiness that Alira felt her own heart swell in response, watching the formidable Alpha King, her entire kingdom feared, soften into something gentler, something that belonged entirely to her, rather than to the crown he carried. He leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished, before finally closing the last distance between them, and kissing her with a tenderness that spoke to every careful, patient month that had led them to this moment. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Cale rested his forehead gently against hers, his hand still cupping her face with careful reverence. "Whatever comes next," he murmured, "whatever complications Lady Vessa or my council might yet raise, I want you to know that this, us, is not something I intend to sacrifice for the sake of strategic convenience. I have spent my entire life making choices for the kingdom's sake. I intend, at last, to make this one choice entirely for myself." They remained in the garden a while longer, wrapped in the quiet, private happiness of a declaration, finally spoken aloud, unaware that a figure watched from a shadowed window overlooking the garden, dark eyes narrowing with cold, calculating fury at the unmistakable intimacy unfolding below. Lady Vessa had suspected the depth of the king's feelings for weeks now, but seeing the confirmation with her own eyes, watching him kiss a servant girl with such open tenderness in the castle's own gardens, hardened whatever careful patience she had maintained into something far more dangerous and immediate. She turned from the window with quiet, deliberate purpose, already calculating the shape of whatever plan might finally remove the obstacle standing so firmly between herself and the crown she had spent years believing was rightfully hers. Whatever love had blossomed between the king and his servant girl, Vessa intended to ensure it would not survive the winter, regardless of what desperate measures such an ending might require. Lady Vessa spent the following days in careful, quiet consultation with a small circle of allies she had cultivated over her years at court. Nobles whose own ambitions aligned closely enough with hers to ensure their discretion, and whose resentment toward the king's unconventional recent choices made them willing accomplices in whatever scheme she chose to pursue. Among them was Lord Denholm, an older noble whose family had long resented Draveth's growing closeness with Calderwin, believing the alliance forged after the war had cost his own family's mining interests dearly in the Eastern Territories. "The servant girl grows too bold," Vessa said, seated in the private drawing room of her castle apartments, the fire casting long shadows across the assembled faces of her small conspiracy. "The king openly declares affection for her now, in the castle gardens, where anyone might witness such an inappropriate display. If this continues unchecked, he may well attempt to elevate her further, perhaps even consider marriage, regardless of how thoroughly such a choice would undermine this kingdom's strategic interests. What do you propose?" Denholm asked, his weathered face creased with the same calculating interest that had made him a valuable, if morally flexible, ally over the years. "Something must be done to remove her from the king's favor," Vessa said, permanently, and in a manner that leaves no possibility of the king's affection overriding whatever consequences follow. She leaned forward, her dark eyes glittering with cold determination. "I have learned something curious these past weeks," something concerning the true nature of the creature this servant girl has been tending so devotedly. A murmur of interest passed through the small gathering, as Vesa revealed what she had pieced together through careful observation and quiet bribery of household servants, the visits from Calderwin's scholars, the emotional reunion between King Garrett and the mysterious creature chained beneath Draveth Castle, the fragments of overheard conversation suggesting the beast was not simply a dangerous animal, but something far more significant to the delicate peace between kingdoms. If the girl's involvement with this creature, whatever its true nature might be, could be framed as something more sinister, Vesa continued, perhaps evidence suggesting she has used dark magic or forbidden knowledge to manipulate both the beast and the king's own judgment, we might turn the council's confidence against her entirely, regardless of the king's personal feelings. Treason, Denholm said slowly, understanding dawning in his shrewd eyes. You mean to accuse her of treason? I mean to ensure she is no longer a factor the king can protect through simple royal favor, Vesa said. If the council believes she poses a genuine threat to the kingdom's security, working perhaps in concert with dark forces to influence both a dangerous creature and the king's own decisions, even his affection will not be enough to shield her from formal justice. The plan that emerged from that private meeting over the following hours was careful and calculated, designed to exploit the very secrecy that had protected Edmund's true identity for so long. Vesa understood that revealing the full truth about the cursed prince would prove too dangerous, too likely to expose her own scheming, rather than genuinely damage Alira's standing, given the sympathy such a tragic story would naturally generate. Instead, she settled on a subtler approach, planting carefully forged evidence suggesting Alira had corresponded secretly with agents from a rival kingdom, using her unusual influence over the castle's dangerous creature and the king's own judgment to further some undisclosed foreign agenda. It took nearly 2 weeks to arrange everything with sufficient care to withstand scrutiny, forged letters bearing convincing enough handwriting to raise suspicion, a bribed guard willing to claim he had witnessed Alira meeting secretly with unknown figures near the castle's outer walls, careful whispers planted among council members already uncertain about the king's unconventional recent judgment. Vesa moved with the patient precision of a woman who had waited years for the right opportunity, unwilling to rush a scheme upon which so much of her future ambitions now depended. Throughout this period, Alira remained largely unaware of the danger steadily gathering around her, her attention consumed instead by the continued search for whatever moment of sacrifice might finally break Edmund's curse, and by the quiet, growing happiness of her declared love with Chaol, which had settled into something both of them treated with careful, private reverence, despite the whispers continuing to circulate through the castle's corridors. Edmund's own progress continued steadily during this time, his awareness and communication growing more sophisticated with each passing week. He had begun, with careful practice, forming rougher shapes with his claws that suggested something more than simple words, attempts, Alira suspected, at communicating more complex thoughts than the dirt floor's crude medium easily allowed. I wonder sometimes, she told him during one quiet afternoon visit, what you would say to me, if you could speak properly again, what your voice sounds like. Edmund's golden eyes studied her for a long moment before he scratched a response into the dirt. Warmer than you might expect. Chaol always said I laughed too easily, even during the war's darkest days. I'd like to hear that laugh someday, Alira said softly, resting her hand against his warm scales. You will, Edmund wrote, with a certainty that offered genuine comfort, despite the uncertainty still surrounding exactly how the curse's final breaking might unfold. I believe that, more than I have believed anything, in 3 long years. Their quiet optimism, however, could not fully shield them from the danger steadily approaching, and on a cold morning, nearly 3 weeks after Chaol's declaration in the garden, Alira found herself summoned unexpectedly to a formal council session, an occurrence so unusual for someone of her position that dread settled immediately into her chest the moment the summons arrived. She dressed carefully, uncertain what such an unprecedented summons might mean, and made her way through the castle's winding corridors toward the council chamber, her mind racing through every possible explanation, none of which offered any real comfort. When she finally arrived, she found the chamber filled with council members and nobles she recognized only vaguely from formal gatherings, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile as she entered. Chaol sat at the head of the long table, his expression carefully controlled despite the visible tension in his shoulders, and beside him, Lady Vesa occupied a seat she had clearly claimed through careful maneuvering, her own expression a mask of concerned civic duty that did nothing to hide the cold satisfaction glittering beneath her dark eyes. "Elira," Cale said, his voice carrying a careful neutrality that did not fully mask the worry beneath it. "You have been summoned before this council to answer serious accusations that have been brought forward regarding your conduct within these castle walls." Elira's heart pounded as she took in the assembled faces, the forged letters spread across the table's polished surface, the guard standing near the chamber's entrance, whose familiar face she recognized but could not immediately place, and the growing, sinking certainty that whatever careful happiness she and Cale had built together over the preceding months was about to face a challenge more dangerous than anything they had yet encountered. "What accusations?" Elira asked, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear coiling tighter with every passing second. Lady Vesa rose from her seat with practiced grace, gathering the forged letters from the table with an expression of grave reluctance that Elira recognized immediately as calculated performance. "It grieves me deeply to bring such matters before this council," Vesa said, her voice carrying the smooth, convincing sincerity that had clearly served her well throughout years of court politics. "But evidence has come to my attention, suggesting that Elira has engaged in secret correspondence with agents working against this kingdom's interests, using her unusual influence over both the king's judgment and the dangerous creature housed beneath this castle to further some undisclosed agenda." "That's not true," Elira said immediately, her pulse racing as Vesa presented the forged letters to the assembled council members, watching their expressions shift toward suspicion as they examined the convincing, damning handwriting. "A guard has come forward," Vesa continued, gesturing toward the man standing near the entrance, whom Elira now recognized as one of the soldiers who had witnessed that first chaotic night in the dungeon months earlier, claiming to have witnessed you meeting secretly with unknown figures near the castle's outer walls on multiple occasions these past weeks. The guard stepped forward, reciting his account with the careful, rehearsed precision of someone well compensated for his cooperation, describing meetings that had never happened, exchanges of information Elira had never made, painting a picture of deliberate treachery that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the truth of her actual conduct within the castle. She listened in mounting horror, understanding with sickening clarity exactly what was happening, exactly whose careful, patient scheming had finally found its opportunity to strike. "This is a lie," she said, turning to Cale with desperate urgency, watching the visible struggle in his expression between his genuine belief in her innocence and the mounting weight of fabricated evidence being presented before an increasingly convinced council. "Cale, please. You know this isn't true." "I know you, Elira," Cale said carefully, though the strain in his voice revealed the impossible position he now occupied, forced to weigh his own certain knowledge of her character against evidence that, however false, appeared damning enough to threaten the stability of his entire council's confidence should he simply dismiss it without proper investigation. "But this council deserves a fair examination of the evidence presented, regardless of my own personal feelings in this matter." "The king's personal feelings," one of the older council members interjected pointedly, "are precisely why this matter requires careful, impartial examination. It has not escaped this council's notice that His Majesty's judgment regarding this particular servant girl has grown increasingly compromised these past months." Vesa's expression carried barely concealed triumph at the direction the conversation was taking, watching her carefully constructed scheme unfold exactly as she had planned, turning the very affection Cale had declared so openly in the garden into a liability that undermined his ability to defend Elira without appearing to place personal feeling above the kingdom's security. "I propose," Vesa continued, her voice carrying the reasonable, measured tone of someone genuinely concerned for the kingdom's welfare, rather than someone orchestrating a calculated betrayal, "that Elira be held for formal questioning while this council investigates the evidence more thoroughly. Given the serious nature of these accusations, and given her unusual access to sensitive matters within this castle, I believe such caution serves everyone's interests, including, ultimately, hers, should she prove innocent of any wrongdoing." The council murmured its assent, several members nodding with the particular relief of people grateful to have a clear, decisive course of action presented before them, rather than continuing to navigate the uncomfortable complexity of the king's compromised judgment. Cale's jaw tightened visibly, his gray eyes carrying a fury he could not fully express within the formal constraints of the council chamber. But even he seemed to recognize, with growing dread, that outright refusal to comply with the council's decision would only deepen suspicions about his own compromised objectivity. "Alira," he said finally, his voice heavy with an apology he could not fully voice before the assembled council, "I am sorry. I will personally ensure this investigation proceeds swiftly and fairly, but I cannot simply dismiss a formal council decision without further undermining confidence in my own judgment, given everything already suspected regarding my feelings in this matter." Alira stared at him, understanding the impossible position he found himself trapped within, even as fear and betrayal churned violently in her chest at the reality of what was about to happen. Two guards moved to flank her, their expressions carefully neutral despite the obvious discomfort several of them displayed at the situation unfolding before them. "I've done nothing wrong," she said, her voice steady, despite the trembling fear beneath it, meeting Cale's anguished gaze one final time, before the guards began escorting her from the chamber. "Whatever evidence has been presented here today is false, manufactured by someone who wishes to see me removed from this castle by any means necessary." "I believe you," Cale said quietly, though his voice carried little comfort, given his evident helplessness, to prevent what was already unfolding. "I will find the truth of this, Alira, I promise you that." As the guards led her from the council chamber, down familiar corridors toward the very dungeon she had once entered freely to tend a chained, suffering creature, Alira caught one final glimpse of Lady Vessa's expression. Cold satisfaction, barely masked beneath careful, performed concern, and understood with complete, sinking certainty that whatever fragile happiness she and Cale had built together over the preceding months now faced its most dangerous test yet, one that threatened not only her own safety, but everything they had worked so carefully to protect. The dungeon cell they placed her in stood only a short distance from Edmund's chamber, close enough that Alira could hear, faintly, the shift and rustle of his massive body through the stone walls separating them. The irony was not lost on her, imprisoned now in the very place she had once entered freely out of compassion, stripped of the trust and standing she had worked so carefully to build over the preceding months. The cell was cold and sparse, containing only a narrow cot and a small barred window too high to offer any real view of the sky beyond. She sat huddled against the stone wall as the hours passed, her mind racing through every detail of the council session, searching for some path forward, some way to prove the falseness of the accusations that had been leveled against her with such convincing, damning precision. She thought of Cale's anguished expression as the guards led her away, the helplessness in his voice even as he promised to find the truth. She believed him, believed in his genuine care for her despite the impossible political position he now occupied, but belief alone offered little comfort against the mounting fear that Lady Vessa's scheme had been constructed with enough careful precision to withstand whatever investigation followed. Word of her imprisonment reached Bridget within hours, the older woman managing, through some combination of determination and long-standing relationships with the castle's guards, to secure a brief visit to Alira's cell that evening, bringing with her a small bundle of bread and a fierce, protective anger that offered more comfort than the food itself. "This is that woman's doing," Bridget said, her weathered face creased with fury as she passed the bread through the cell's narrow bars. "Lady Vessa, the whole kitchen has been talking of nothing else since word spread. Everyone knows those accusations are nonsense, child. You've never once left this castle these past months, let alone conspired with foreign agents. Knowing something and proving it are different matters," Alira said wearily, though Bridget's fierce loyalty offered some small comfort against the weight of fear pressing down on her. "The king won't let this stand," Bridget insisted, though even her fierce confidence carried an edge of uncertainty. "Whatever complications his counsel has raised, he cares for you too deeply to simply abandon you to false accusations." Alira wanted desperately to believe this, but the memory of Cale's helpless expression in the council chamber, the careful political constraints binding even a king's actions, left her uncertain exactly how quickly, or how successfully, he might be able to unravel whatever careful scheme Vessa had constructed against her. As the night deepened and Bridget was finally forced to leave, warned away by a guard uncomfortable with the extended visit, Elira found herself alone once more in the cold cell, listening to the distant, restless sounds of Edmund shifting in his own chamber nearby. She wondered if he understood what had happened, if he could sense, even through stone walls, the danger and distress she now faced. She did not have to wonder for long. Sometime past midnight, as exhaustion finally began pulling her toward uneasy sleep, a sound like tearing metal echoed through the dungeon's stone corridors, followed by a deep, furious roar that shook dust loose from the ceiling above her cell. Elira jolted upright, her heart pounding, as the sound of enormous claws scraping against stone grew steadily closer, accompanied by shouts of alarm from the guards stationed throughout the dungeon. "He's broken free," she heard one guard shout to another, panic evident in his voice. "The beast has broken his chains." Moments later, Edmund's massive form appeared at the end of the corridor outside her cell, his golden eyes blazing with an intensity she had never witnessed before, smoke curling from his nostrils as he moved with deliberate, unmistakable purpose toward her cell. The guards who had been stationed nearby scattered before his approach, none willing to risk direct confrontation with a creature capable of such obvious, overwhelming power. "Edmund," Elira breathed, pressing herself against the bars separating them. "What are you doing? You need to stop, before someone gets hurt." The dragon reached her cell, and studied her for a long moment through the bars, his golden eyes carrying an intelligence and determination that left no doubt he understood exactly the danger she faced, and had chosen, without hesitation, to act against it, regardless of the consequences. With careful, deliberate strength, he closed one enormous claw around the cell's iron bars and, with a groan of tortured metal, tore them away from the surrounding stone, as though they were nothing more substantial than dried twigs. "Edmund, wait," Elira said, even as relief and alarm warred within her at his unexpected dramatic intervention. "This will only make things worse. They'll say I orchestrated this, that I used you to escape rather than face the council's investigation." The dragon paused, clearly weighing her words, before lowering his head and nudging her gently, but insistently, toward the opening he had created. Elira understood, watching the fierce protectiveness in his golden eyes, that he had no intention of leaving her imprisoned, regardless of the political complications such a rescue might create, his loyalty and care for her overriding whatever careful caution might otherwise have guided his actions. Before she could decide how to respond, footsteps thundered down the dungeon stairs, and Cale appeared at the corridor's entrance, flanked by several of his most trusted guards, his expression carrying a mixture of alarm and something else, something that shifted rapidly to relief, the moment his gray eyes found Elira standing safely beside the torn-open cell bars. "What happened here?" he demanded, taking in the scene with rapid, assessing attention, the destroyed bars, Edmund's protective stance beside Elira, the scattered, frightened guards, still recovering from the dragon's dramatic display of strength. "He broke me out," Elira said, though guilt and worry colored her voice despite the relief of no longer being confined behind iron bars. "I tried to stop him, Cale, I swear it, but he wouldn't listen. He sensed something was wrong, and he acted before I could explain why staying might have been the wiser choice." Cale's gaze moved to Edmund, studying his old friend with an expression that mixed concern with something like understanding, recognizing the fierce loyalty that had driven such a dramatic, dangerous action. "He has always been protective of those he loves," Cale said quietly. "Even trapped as he is, that part of him clearly remains unchanged." He turned back to Elira, closing the distance between them with quick, purposeful steps, and pulled her into an embrace that spoke to hours of worry and fear finally finding release. "I have spent every moment since that council session searching for evidence to counter Vessa's claims," he murmured against her hair. "I should have found a way to prevent your imprisonment entirely, and I am sorry that I failed to do so, quickly enough to spare you this fear." "What happens now?" Elira asked, pulling back slightly to search his face for answers. "Edmund broke me out of a cell the council placed me in. That will only strengthen whatever case Vessa has built against me." Cale's expression hardened with fresh determination. "I have already uncovered enough evidence these past hours to prove those forged letters false, and to identify the guard who provided false testimony as having received substantial payment for his cooperation. Vessa's scheme is beginning to unravel, Elira, faster than she likely anticipated when she constructed it." He glanced toward Edmund, who remained protectively close, his golden eyes still watchful and alert. As for tonight's events, I intend to present them not as an escape, but as exactly what they were. A devoted friend, acting to protect someone he cares for, from grave injustice. That is not a crime this council can easily condemn, particularly once the falseness of the original accusations becomes clear. Relief and exhaustion warred within Alira as she absorbed his words, understanding that whatever danger tonight's dramatic events might have introduced, Kale's determination to uncover the truth and protect her offered genuine hope that the worst of Vessa's scheme might yet be overcome. But even as that hope bloomed, she could not shake the certainty that Lady Vessa, having invested so much careful calculation into tonight's failed scheme, would not simply retreat quietly now that her plans had begun to unravel, and that whatever confrontation still awaited them would prove more dangerous and more decisive than anything they had yet faced together. They returned to Edmund's chamber together, Kale insisting on personally overseeing the repair of the broken cell bars and the reinforcement of the dungeon's security, though this time his focus centered on protecting Alira from further danger rather than containing Edmund's supposed threat. The guards who worked through the remaining hours of the night carried out their tasks with a new, quiet respect, having witnessed firsthand the fierce loyalty and protective intelligence that clearly defined the creature they had once feared as nothing more than a dangerous beast. As dawn began to lighten the sky beyond the castle's high windows, Kale summoned his most trusted advisors to review the evidence he had gathered through the night, methodically dismantling the foundation of lies Lady Vessa had constructed with such careful, patient precision. The forged letters, upon closer examination by scholars familiar with authentic diplomatic correspondence, revealed telling inconsistencies in both handwriting and official seals that no genuine foreign agent would have carelessly included. The guard who had provided false testimony, confronted privately with evidence of payments traced back to Lady Vessa's own household accounts, broke down within minutes, confessing the full truth of his fabricated account in exchange for leniency regarding his own complicity in the scheme. She has been planning this for weeks, Kale told Alira later that morning, as they sat together in his study, exhaustion evident in both their expressions after the long, difficult night. Perhaps longer. The guard's testimony alone traces payments back nearly a month, suggesting she began constructing this scheme almost immediately after our declaration in the garden. "What will you do?" Alira asked, though a part of her already anticipated the difficult political calculation such a confrontation would require, given Vessa's considerable standing and influence among the council. "I will present the full evidence to the council this afternoon," Kale said, his voice carrying a hard determination that reminded Alira, not for the first time, of the formidable ruler, capable of commanding absolute loyalty, despite fear and uncertainty. "Her scheme will be exposed publicly, before the same council she manipulated into imprisoning you unjustly. Whatever influence she has cultivated over the years will not survive such a clear demonstration of her willingness to fabricate evidence and bribe witnesses against an innocent person. She won't simply accept defeat quietly," Alira warned, remembering the cold, calculating fury she had glimpsed beneath Vessa's polished exterior during their first confrontation, months earlier. "A woman who has invested this much careful planning into removing me from your favor will not retreat without attempting something further, particularly once she understands her scheme has fully unraveled." Kale's expression grew grave, acknowledging the truth of her warning. "I have already increased security around both your quarters and Edmund's chamber, and I intend to ensure Vessa herself faces careful monitoring until this matter reaches full resolution before the council." He reached across the small distance between them, taking her hand in his with quiet reassurance. "I will not allow her desperation, however dangerous it might prove, to threaten you further, Alira. I promise you that." The afternoon council session that followed proved as dramatic as either of them had anticipated. Kale presented the evidence methodically, laying out each fabricated document alongside expert testimony confirming their falseness, revealing the guard's confession regarding payments received from Lady Vessa's own household accounts, and calling forward several household servants who confirmed, under careful questioning, patterns of suspicious activity within Vessa's private apartments in the weeks preceding the accusations. Lady Vessa's careful composure finally cracked as the weight of evidence mounted against her, her earlier performed concern giving way to something colder and more desperate, as she recognized the collapse of everything she had worked so patiently to construct. She attempted, briefly, to deflect the accusations, suggesting the evidence itself had been manufactured to discredit her, rather than reveal genuine truth. But the council, having witnessed the methodical, undeniable presentation of facts, found little credibility in her increasingly desperate protests. "This council owes Alira a formal apology," Cale said finally, his voice carrying across the chamber with unmistakable authority, "for the grave injustice inflicted upon her through fabricated evidence and manipulated testimony, orchestrated by Lady Vessa in pursuit of her own personal ambitions." He turned to face Vessa directly, his gray eyes hard with a fury he had carefully restrained until this moment. "As for you, Lady Vessa, your actions represent nothing less than a betrayal of this council's trust, and a genuine threat to the security and stability you claim to be protecting through your false accusations. I strip you of your standing within this council, effective immediately, and confine you to your family's estates pending further consideration of what additional consequences your actions might warrant." The council chamber fell into stunned silence at the severity of Cale's judgment, though few among the assembled nobles seemed inclined to challenge a decision so clearly supported by overwhelming evidence. Vessa's expression, as guards moved to escort her from the chamber, carried a mixture of fury and disbelief, her carefully constructed ambitions collapsing entirely in the space of a single afternoon's methodical revelation. "This isn't finished," she hissed, as the guards guided her toward the chamber's entrance, her dark eyes finding Alira's across the room, with a venomous promise that sent an uneasy chill through Alira's chest, despite the relief of the day's outcome. "You may have won this battle, servant girl, but you will never truly belong in this world, regardless of whatever fleeting favor you currently enjoy." The threat lingered in the air, even after Vessa had been led away, a reminder that despite the day's clear victory, the danger she represented might not be so easily or fully contained. Alira found herself unable to fully relax into the relief of vindication, aware that a woman capable of such patient, calculated scheming would not simply abandon her ambitions without attempting some final, desperate action before accepting complete defeat. That evening, as Cale escorted her personally back toward her quarters, his hand warm and reassuring around hers despite the day's exhausting events, Alira could not shake the growing certainty that Lady Vessa's parting threat carried more weight than simple wounded pride, and that whatever final confrontation still awaited them would prove far more dangerous than anything they had yet faced in their months-long journey toward breaking Edmund's curse and building a life together against every obstacle standing in their way. 3 days passed, following Lady Vessa's public disgrace, and the castle gradually settled back into a calmer rhythm, though Alira noticed the careful, watchful attention Cale maintained regarding her safety, guards stationed more visibly near her quarters and near the dungeon entrance, where she continued her regular visits with Edmund. Whatever confidence the council's judgment had restored to her standing within the castle, both Cale and Alira remained wary of Vessa's parting threat, unwilling to assume the danger had fully passed, simply because her formal influence had been stripped away. Edmund, sensing the lingering tension despite the day's clear victory, had grown increasingly restless during Alira's visits, his golden eyes tracking every unfamiliar sound within the dungeon's stone corridors with heightened alertness. "Something still feels wrong," he scratched into the dirt one afternoon, his claw moving with more urgency than she had seen from him in weeks. "I do not trust that her defeat means her danger has ended." "I feel the same," Alira admitted, settling beside him with the careful, comfortable familiarity that had become second nature over the preceding months. "But Cale has taken every precaution he can manage. Guards watch her family's estate. Her movements are monitored closely. Guards can be paid," Edmund wrote, a grim reminder of exactly how Vessa had constructed her original scheme through careful bribery and manipulation. "Watch yourself carefully, until we are certain her threat has truly passed." Alira took his warning seriously, maintaining heightened vigilance during her daily movements through the castle, though the following days passed without any obvious sign of renewed danger, allowing a cautious, gradual relaxation to settle back over both her own guarded caution and the broader castle's collective anxiety. It was on the 4th evening after Vessa's confinement to her family estates that the true danger finally revealed itself, arriving not through the careful political scheming that had defined her previous attack, but through something far more direct and desperate. Alira had finished her evening visit with Edmund later than usual, the two of them having spent long hours discussing memories of his childhood with Cale, and she made her way back up the dungeon stairs alone. The guards who typically accompanied her having been called away moments earlier to address some minor disturbance elsewhere in the castle. A distraction, she would later understand, carefully orchestrated to create precisely this opportunity. She had barely reached the upper corridor when a figure emerged from the shadows near an unused storage chamber, moving with the swift, desperate purpose of someone who had abandoned all careful calculation in favor of immediate, dangerous action. Lady Vessa's face, when Elira finally recognized her in the dim torchlight, carried none of the polished composure she had maintained throughout their previous confrontations, replaced instead by something wild and unhinged, the desperate fury of a woman who had lost everything she had spent years carefully building. "You," Vessa hissed, closing the distance between them with alarming speed, a small blade glinting in her trembling hand. "You have taken everything from me, the crown I deserved, the standing I spent years cultivating, all of it, stolen by a common kitchen girl who somehow managed to charm her way into a king's affections." "Lady Vessa," Elira said carefully, backing away slowly, while searching desperately for any escape route or means of calling for help. "Please, put down the blade. Whatever grievance you feel, this isn't the way to address it." "There is no other way left to me," Vessa said, her voice cracking with barely contained hysteria. "You have destroyed every path forward I once had. I will not simply accept such complete ruin without ensuring you understand the true cost of what you have taken from me." She lunged forward with sudden, violent speed, and Elira barely managed to dodge the blade's initial strike, stumbling backward against the corridor's stone wall, as fear and adrenaline surged through her chest. Vessa's second attempt came faster still, and Elira realized with sickening clarity that she had no clear path to escape the confined corridor, no way to call for help before the desperate, unhinged noblewoman closed the distance between them entirely. It was in that moment of genuine mortal danger that Elira heard the distinctive thunderous sound of enormous claws against stone, growing rapidly closer from the dungeon stairs behind her. Edmund burst into the corridor with a speed that belied his massive size, positioning his enormous body between Elira and Vessa's advancing blade, with an urgency that left no doubt regarding his fierce protective intent. Vessa froze at the sight of the dragon's sudden appearance, her desperate fury giving way momentarily to genuine fear, as Edmund's golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that promised immediate, severe consequence should she attempt to press her attack any further. But her desperation, having already carried her this far past the point of careful calculation, proved stronger than her fear, and she lunged forward one final time, aiming her blade not at Elira directly now, but at Edmund's exposed side, seemingly hoping to eliminate the obstacle standing between herself and her original target. What happened next unfolded with a speed that left Elira barely able to process the sequence of events even as she lived through them. Seeing the blade's trajectory toward Edmund, understanding instinctively that whatever protection he offered came at genuine risk to himself, Elira acted without conscious thought, throwing herself forward to intercept the strike meant for the creature who had risked everything to protect her. The blade caught her along her upper arm, rather than finding a more vital target, a sharp, burning pain exploding through her senses as she collided with Edmund's scaled side, her own body now positioned protectively before his, in an instinctive, selfless reversal of the very protection he had rushed to offer her, only moments before. Vessa stumbled backward at the unexpected outcome, her blade clattering to the stone floor, as the reality of what she had done, what she had nearly caused, seemed finally to penetrate her desperate fury. In that same instant, a brilliant, golden light erupted from where Edmund's scales pressed against Elira's wounded arm, warm and impossibly bright, filling the entire corridor with a radiance that made both combatants freeze in stunned amazement. The light intensified rapidly, wrapping around Edmund's massive form with growing intensity, and Elira, even through the pain of her wound, understood with sudden, overwhelming clarity exactly what was happening. This was the moment the ancient texts had described. A choice made when something significant stood to be lost, a selfless act of genuine sacrifice, offered without hesitation or calculation, exactly the binding moment required to finally, fully break the curse that had held Edmund captive for 3 long years. The light grew blinding, and Elira felt herself pushed gently backward by some unseen force, as Edmund's enormous form began to shift and change within the golden radiance, scales dissolving into something else entirely, the massive shape shrinking and transforming with a speed that defied everything she understood about the curse's slow, careful undoing over the preceding months. When the light finally faded, leaving the corridor in comparative darkness once more, Illyra found herself staring not at the familiar dragon she had tended so carefully for months, but at a man, kneeling on the stone floor where the creature had stood only moments before, breathing hard, his dark hair disheveled, his features carrying an unmistakable resemblance to both Cale's memories and Garrett's own familiar face. Edmund looked up, his eyes, still that same striking gold she had come to know so well, meeting hers with an expression of stunned, overwhelming wonder. "Illyra!" he said, his voice rough with disuse, but unmistakably his own. Human and whole, for the first time in 3 long years. "You broke it. You actually broke the curse." Before either of them could process the full magnitude of what had just occurred, running footsteps echoed through the corridor as Cale arrived, drawn by the commotion, his expression shifting rapidly from alarm to complete, stunned disbelief as he took in the scene before him. His oldest friend restored to human form, Lady Vessa frozen in shock nearby, and Illyra, wounded but alive, standing at the center of a transformation none of them had fully dared to hope might happen so suddenly, so completely. "Edmund," Cale breathed, crossing the distance between them with disbelieving urgency, pulling his restored friend into an embrace that spoke to 3 years of guilt and hope, finally finding their long-awaited resolution. When he finally released Edmund, his gray eyes immediately found Illyra, taking in the blood staining her sleeve with fresh alarm. "You're hurt. What happened here?" "Lady Vessa," Illyra managed, exhaustion and pain beginning to catch up with her now that the immediate danger had passed. "She attacked me. Edmund tried to protect me, and I—" She glanced toward the man who had so recently been a dragon, understanding beginning to fully settle over her despite the pain and shock of the preceding moments. "I suppose I protected him in return, without fully thinking about what that choice might mean." Cale's gaze moved to Vessa, still frozen against the corridor's far wall, her expression a mixture of horror and disbelief at the transformation she had inadvertently triggered through her own desperate violence. His expression hardened with a fury more absolute than anything Illyra had witnessed from him before, the careful restraint of political calculation entirely abandoned in favor of protective rage. "Guards," he called out, his voice carrying with unmistakable command through the corridor. "Seize Lady Vessa immediately. She has attempted murder against a member of this household, and inadvertently revealed a truth this kingdom has protected for 3 long years." He turned back to Illyra, gently examining her wounded arm with careful, urgent attention. "We need to get you to a healer immediately. This can wait, but your safety cannot." As guards arrived to take Vessa into custody, her desperate protests and pleas falling on unsympathetic ears given the clear evidence of her attempted violence, Illyra found herself supported carefully, between Cale and Edmund, both men's attention focused entirely on her well-being, despite the extraordinary, world-changing transformation that had just occurred. The pain in her arm throbbed steadily, but beneath it, she felt something else entirely, a quiet, overwhelming joy at having witnessed, and somehow been the catalyst for, exactly the miracle they had all worked so desperately to achieve over the preceding months. Whatever consequences still awaited them, whatever formal justice Lady Vessa's desperate crime would ultimately require, Illyra understood, even through her pain and exhaustion, that everything had finally, truly, changed. Edmund stood before her now, fully human, fully restored, his curse broken at last through an act of selfless love neither ancient text nor careful calculation could have fully predicted or guaranteed. And beside her, Cale's hand remained firmly, protectively wrapped around her own, a silent promise that whatever came next, they would face it together, exactly as they had faced everything else throughout their long, difficult journey toward this unexpected, hard-won victory. The castle healer tended to Illyra's wound within the hour, confirming with relief that the blade had struck no vital tissue, leaving only a shallow cut that would heal cleanly with proper care and rest. Cale refused to leave her side throughout the examination, his fingers laced through hers even as the healer worked, his gray eyes carrying a mixture of lingering fear and quiet gratitude that spoke louder than any words he might have offered. Edmund, dressed now in simple clothing hastily gathered from the castle's stores, remained close as well, still visibly adjusting to the strange, overwhelming reality of his restored human form. After 3 long years, trapped within the dragon's massive shape, he moved with careful, deliberate attention, as though relearning the basic mechanics of human movement, flexing fingers that had spent 3 years as claws, testing a voice that had spent 3 years silent, except for the low, wordless sounds a dragon's throat could produce. "It feels strange," he admitted, settling into a chair near Alira's bed once the healer had finished her work. Being small again, being able to speak without scratching words into dirt. A genuine warm smile crossed his face, the first Alira had witnessed from him in his human form, and she understood immediately why Kael had once described his laugh as coming too easily, even during difficult times. "I cannot thank you enough, Alira, for everything you sacrificed to bring me back to myself." "You saved me first," Alira reminded him gently. "I only returned the favor, without fully understanding what that choice might trigger." "That is precisely what the old text described," Edmund said, his expression growing more thoughtful. "A choice made without calculation, without expectation of what it might accomplish. You did not save me hoping to break the curse, Alira. You saved me because it was simply the right thing to do, regardless of the cost to yourself." He glanced toward Kael, something warm and grateful passing between the 2 old friends. "That is a rarer thing than either of us fully appreciated, I think, until we witnessed it firsthand." Word of Edmund's restoration, and Lady Vessa's attempted crime, spread rapidly through the castle over the following days, transforming the household's understanding of everything that had unfolded over the preceding months. The full truth, previously guarded so carefully to protect the fragile peace between kingdoms, could no longer remain hidden, and Kael made the decision, alongside Garrett, who had remained at Draveth Castle throughout the unfolding crisis, to formally acknowledge the truth before the full court, rather than allowing rumor and speculation to distort the story further. The formal announcement, made before an assembled gathering of nobles and household staff alike, revealed the complete history of the war's tragic final chapter: the sorcerer's cruel curse, Kael's 3 years of guilt-laden searching, and finally, Alira's remarkable selfless devotion that had accomplished what no formal effort had managed to achieve. The court's reaction carried a complicated mixture of astonishment, relief, and, among those who had witnessed Alira's rise from humble servant to central figure in this extraordinary story, genuine admiration for the courage and compassion she had shown throughout. Lady Vessa's formal judgment followed swiftly, the council, having witnessed both her earlier scheme of fabricated evidence and her subsequent violent attack, showing little mercy for actions that had endangered not only Alira's life, but nearly disrupted the delicate, hard-won restoration of Edmund's humanity. She was stripped entirely of her noble title and standing, her family's lands placed under careful royal oversight, given her father's apparent ignorance of his daughter's desperate scheming, and she herself sentenced to permanent exile from Draveth's borders, a fate that, while merciful compared to more severe punishments the council had initially proposed, ensured she would never again pose a threat to the kingdom or those who had suffered under her ambitious cruelty. With the immediate danger fully resolved and the truth finally revealed to the entire kingdom, Kael found himself facing a decision he had been quietly considering for weeks, one that had grown only more certain in his mind following the extraordinary events of recent days. He summoned his full council one final time, several days after Alira's wound had begun to properly heal, and stood before them with a resolve that left no room for the careful political calculation that had once governed so many of his decisions. "I have spent this entire year," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled chamber, "watching this council debate the merits of strategic marriage, of alliances built on political convenience rather than genuine partnership. I have watched a woman I trusted attempt murder and treason in pursuit of exactly such an alliance, believing her noble birth entitled her to a crown, regardless of the character or compassion required to wear it wisely." He paused, his gray eyes finding Alira's across the chamber, where she stood beside Edmund and Garrett, watching his declaration with growing, hopeful anticipation. "I have also watched a servant girl, with no noble birth and no political ambition whatsoever, risk her own life without hesitation to protect a suffering creature everyone else feared, accomplish what 3 years of my own desperate searching could not, and ultimately sacrifice her own safety, to save a friend she had come to love, as deeply as I love her myself." A murmur passed through the assembled council, though Cale continued before anyone could interject, his voice growing steadily more resolute with each word. "I intend to marry Elira," he said simply, the declaration carrying the full weight of a decision made not through careful political calculation, but through genuine, unshakable conviction. "Not because my counsel advises it, and I suspect several of you will find considerable reason to advise against it, but because I have found in her exactly the character and compassion this kingdom deserves in its future queen, qualities that matter far more, in my judgment, than birth or lineage or the strategic advantages such considerations typically demand." The chamber fell into stunned silence at the directness of his declaration, several council members exchanging uncertain glances, clearly weighing the unprecedented nature of such a match against the undeniable evidence of Elira's remarkable character that recent events had so thoroughly demonstrated. It was Garrett, rising from his own seat among the assembled nobles, who finally broke the silence, his voice carrying the authority of a fellow king, whose own brother's restoration owed everything to the woman now being proposed as Draveth's future queen. "Calderwin fully supports this union," Garrett announced, his expression carrying genuine warmth as he looked toward Elira. "Whatever concerns this council might raise regarding tradition or precedent, I can offer no stronger endorsement than the simple truth that this woman restored my brother to me, after 3 years of assumed loss, through nothing but genuine, selfless devotion. Any kingdom fortunate enough to call her queen will be fortunate indeed." With Calderwin's public support behind Cale's declaration, the council's remaining hesitation gave way gradually to acceptance, several members openly acknowledging that the extraordinary circumstances surrounding Elira's rise and the clear demonstration of both her character and the genuine devotion she and Cale shared offered a foundation for partnership that traditional strategic marriages had rarely provided so convincingly. Elira, standing at the center of this unprecedented declaration, felt overwhelmed by the rapid, extraordinary transformation her life had undergone since that first chaotic night in the dungeon, when curiosity and compassion had first drawn her toward a chained, suffering creature everyone else feared to approach. She looked toward Cale, meeting his steady, hopeful gaze across the chamber, and felt the full weight and wonder of everything that had led them both to this remarkable moment settle warmly over her heart. "Elira," Cale said, crossing the chamber to stand before her, dropping to one knee before the full assembled court, in a gesture that carried far more significance than simple formal courtesy. "Will you marry me? Not simply as your king, but as the man who has come to love you more deeply than I ever believed myself capable of loving another person." The chamber held its collective breath as Elira looked down at him, at the formidable Alpha King her entire kingdom had once feared, now kneeling before her with nothing but genuine, unguarded hope in his gray eyes, and felt her own heart swell with a joy she had never dared fully imagine finding in her life. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. "I will marry you, Cale." The chamber erupted into applause and celebration, as Cale rose and pulled her into an embrace, the formal council session transforming rapidly into genuine, joyful celebration, as word of the king's engagement began spreading through the castle's corridors, carrying with it the extraordinary story of a servant girl who had tamed a feared dragon, broken an ancient curse, and won not only a kingdom's respect but the heart of its formidable king, all through nothing more than genuine, selfless compassion, offered freely to a suffering creature everyone else had been too afraid to approach. The wedding took place 2 months later, once Elira's wound had fully healed, and the kingdom had time to properly prepare for a celebration unlike any Draveth had witnessed in generations. The castle gardens, where Cale had first declared his love beneath the bare autumn branches, now bloomed with the season's first spring flowers, transformed into a setting of quiet, natural beauty, for a ceremony that would unite not only a king and his chosen bride, but symbolically, the long-fractured peace between Draveth and Calderwin as well. Garrett traveled from Calderwin once more for the occasion, bringing with him a delegation far larger and more celebratory than his previous, tension-filled visit, along with formal gifts symbolizing the renewed, genuine friendship between their two kingdoms. Edmund, fully recovered from his 3 years of curse-bound suffering, stood beside Cale, as his closest friend, and chosen witness to the ceremony. His presence, a living testament, to everything Alira's courage and compassion had accomplished. Bridget, seated proudly among the honored guests despite her usual place in the castle kitchens, watched the ceremony, with tears streaming freely down her weathered face, overcome with pride at witnessing the remarkable transformation of the quiet, overlooked kitchen girl she had come to love as family, into a queen whose kindness had changed the course of an entire kingdom's history. Alira wore a simple gown of pale blue silk, elegant but unadorned, with the elaborate jewels and embellishments that might have suited a bride born to noble standing, a deliberate choice that felt true to the humble, genuine character that had won Cale's heart in the first place. As she walked through the garden toward where he waited, surrounded by blooming flowers and the warm afternoon sunlight, she felt the full weight and wonder of the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a frightened servant girl sneaking stolen bread, to a chained, suffering creature, to the woman now walking toward marriage, with the very king who ruled the kingdom she called home. Cale watched her approach with an expression of such open, unguarded joy that Alira felt her own heart swell with matching happiness, understanding, as she reached him and took his offered hands, that whatever challenges still lay ahead for them as king and queen, they would face every one of them together, bound by a love that had proven itself capable of breaking curses and defeating desperate ambition alike. The ceremony itself was simple but deeply moving, presided over by the kingdom's eldest priest, who spoke of love that transcended birth and circumstance, of courage that revealed itself not through grand gestures, but through quiet, consistent kindness, offered without expectation of reward. When Cale finally kissed his new bride, before the assembled celebrating crowd, the cheer that erupted through the garden carried a genuine warmth and joy that spoke to how thoroughly Alira had won not only her king's heart, but the affection and respect of the entire kingdom she now called her own. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, filled with music and feasting, and the particular joy of a kingdom celebrating not merely a royal wedding, but the resolution of old wounds finally healed after 3 long years of guilt and suffering. Dadmund, settling comfortably into his restored life, spoke openly and warmly of his gratitude toward Alira throughout the evening, sharing with anyone willing to listen the remarkable story of the servant girl, whose selfless compassion had accomplished what years of desperate searching could not. Late in the evening, as the formal celebrations began winding down, and guests drifted toward quieter conversation and rest, Alira found herself standing alone, with Cale, near the same stone fountain where he had first declared his love, beneath the bare branches of autumn. The garden had transformed considerably since that evening, spring's warmth and blooming color replacing winter's cold, bare starkness, much as their own lives had transformed from careful, guarded uncertainty into the open, celebrated joy of this remarkable day. "Do you remember?" Cale asked softly, wrapping his arms around her as they stood together beneath the darkening sky, "when I told you I had begun to believe a simpler, freely chosen life might still be possible for me, despite everything the war and the crown had taken from me?" "I remember," Alira said, leaning back against him with quiet contentment. "I did not fully understand, that evening, exactly how remarkable that chosen life would prove to be," he said, pressing a gentle kiss against her hair. "I expected, perhaps, some measure of quiet happiness, some small escape from the endless duty and calculation that had defined my life since my father's death. I did not expect to find a queen whose courage would break ancient curses, whose compassion would inspire an entire kingdom, whose love would prove strong enough to weather every obstacle placed before us." "We faced those obstacles together," Alira reminded him gently. "I could not have accomplished any of it alone, not the connection with Edmund, not surviving Vessa's schemes, not any of it, without your support and protection throughout." "Perhaps," Cale acknowledged, "but I have come to believe, watching everything unfold these past months, that your particular gift, for genuine, selfless kindness, would have found its way toward remarkable accomplishment, regardless of the circumstances surrounding it. I simply feel fortunate beyond measure that fate chose to place that gift within my own kingdom, within my own dungeon, tending to my own dearest friend, allowing me the extraordinary privilege of witnessing it firsthand, and eventually winning your heart alongside it." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long while after that, watching the last of the evening stars emerge across the darkening sky, the sounds of the continuing celebration drifting softly from the castle's great hall behind them. Alira thought of everything that had led her to this remarkable moment. The frightened servant girl who had once crept down dungeon stairs with stolen bread, driven by nothing more than simple, instinctive compassion for a creature everyone else feared. She had never imagined, on that first chaotic night months ago, that such a small, quiet act of kindness might eventually lead to breaking an ancient curse, defeating a desperate noblewoman's dangerous ambition, and finding, against every impossible odd, genuine love with the formidable king her entire kingdom had once feared above all else. Edmund's laughter, warm and genuine exactly as Cale had once described it, carried faintly from the celebration continuing within the castle's great hall, a sound of restored joy that would have seemed impossible only a year earlier, when a suffering, chained creature had cried alone in the dungeon's cold darkness, with no one willing to approach except a servant girl, too compassionate to simply walk away. The kingdom of Draveth would remember this story for generations to come, told and retold through countless variations as the years passed, the tale of a feared Alpha King's dragon, and the humble servant girl whose fearless compassion had broken an ancient curse, defeated desperate treachery, and ultimately proven that true strength and true nobility had little to do with birth or crown or fearsome reputation, and everything to do with the simple, courageous choice to offer kindness freely, even to those the rest of the world had already decided to fear. And as Cale and Alira stood together beneath the star-filled sky, their future stretching ahead of them full of promise and partnership, both understood, with quiet, certain gratitude, that whatever challenges still awaited a king and his unconventional, remarkable queen, they would face every single one of them exactly as they had faced everything before, together, with courage, compassion, and a love strong enough to have broken curses and changed the course of an entire kingdom's history.